Hello there. Tonight we travel to one of the oldest continuous civilizations on Earth, a world of underground armies built for emperors, bronze masks carved for gods no modern scholar can name, cities swallowed whole beneath lakes, and caverns so large they could hold cathedrals carved by hands that left behind no record, no name, and no explanation. China's history spans 5,000 documented years, and in those 5,000 years it produced wonders that we can measure, photograph and study closely without ever arriving at a complete answer for how they were made, or why, or by whom. These are real mysteries investigated by real archaeologists, historians and engineers, and they remain genuinely open. Before we begin, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, and tell me in the comments where you are listening from and what time it is for you. The visuals you see are just for enjoyment. They are not necessary to follow along. This video is meant to be heard in the background whether you are studying, resting, or getting ready to sleep. Now let's begin. Picture standing at the edge of the Los Plateau in Shaanxi province on a clear winter morning. The yellow soil stretched out around you in all directions. The Wei River silver in the distance. The air carrying the faint cold smell of dust and compressed time. The landscape looks empty. It looks like it has always been empty. Agricultural land, terraced fields, the occasional farmhouse. There is nothing visible to suggest that beneath your feet, under perhaps 30 feet of compressed yellow earth, one of the most extraordinary collections of human-made objects ever assembled is waiting in the dark. China keeps its secrets underground. That is one of the defining characteristics of Chinese civilization across its 5,000-year span. The things that matter most are buried deliberately and carefully in the earth. Emperors are interred beneath mountains of moved soil with the contents of entire palaces arranged around them. Cities are abandoned and built over again until the accumulated layers of a single urban site represent 20 generations of different civilizations stacked in vertical sequence. Writing was done on bones and shells and buried. Bronze vessels of supreme ritual importance were cast, used in ceremonies of states that no longer exist, and then interred in pits whose locations were forgotten. The Earth of China is an archive, and we have been reading it for barely a century, and every time we dig a new section of it, we find something that changes what we thought we knew. The scale of what remains unexcavated is difficult to comprehend. It is estimated that less than 1% of China's known archaeological sites have been formally excavated. The rest are still in the ground. When construction workers break ground for a new road or housing development and discover something ancient in the first meter of soil, which happens with a frequency that has made China's construction industry one of the world's most reliable sources of unexpected archaeological discovery. The site is examined, documented, and in many cases covered back up because there is simply not enough time, funding, or personnel to excavate everything the Earth of China contains. Tonight, we look at 20 of the mysteries that the excavated fraction has already produced, 20 questions that the physical evidence raises, and that 5,000 years of meticulous record-keeping, one of the world's most literate civilizations, and the full resources of modern science have not yet been able to answer completely. Mystery 1. The Terracotta Army. The anomalies nobody talks about. In March of 1974, farmers digging a well in the Lintong district of Shaanxi province broke through a layer of hardened soil and found themselves looking into a pit containing broken pieces of fired clay. They were not the first people to encounter that underground space. Local historical accounts suggest people had been finding fired clay fragments in that soil for years, possibly decades, without understanding what they represented. But the 1974 discovery was large enough and clear enough that it triggered a formal archaeological investigation, and what the investigation revealed over the following weeks, months, and decades is one of the most extraordinary archaeological sites ever uncovered anywhere in the world. The Terracotta Army of Qin Shi Huang, the first emperor of a unified China, who died in 210 BCE, comprises more than 8,000 life-sized ceramic warriors arranged in battle formation in a series of underground pits adjacent to the emperor's burial mound. 8,000 individual soldiers, plus 130 chariots, 670 horses, and various non-combat figures including acrobats, musicians, and officials, all of them made from fired clay, all of them arranged with military precision in corridors separated by load-bearing earthen walls, all of them originally painted in bright pigments, red, green, blue, purple, black, that survived 22 centuries underground before being destroyed within minutes of exposure to open air. As oxygen reacted with the lacquer base of the paint, and the colors simply vanished while researchers watched helplessly. The existence of the terracotta army is known to almost everyone. The scale of it, the ambition of it, the sheer organizational achievement of manufacturing 8,000 individual figures of this size and quality in the decade or so available for the project. All of this is discussed widely and celebrated as one of humanity's great artistic and logistical achievements. What is discussed considerably less widely are the specific anomalies embedded in the army that continue to puzzle researchers after 50 years of close study. The first anomaly is the faces. The popular account states that every figure has a unique face, that the makers individually modeled 8,000 distinct portraits. This claim is approximately correct but more complicated than it sounds. Researchers have established that the army was manufactured using a standardized modular production system. Heads were produced separately from bodies using a limited set of molds for the basic facial shape. Approximately 10 distinct base mold types have been identified. Individual details, hairstyles, mustaches, beards, ears, nose shapes, the specific set of the jaw, were then added by hand to each head after molding, using clay applied over the basic form. The result is figures clearly related to each other in structural architecture but distinguished by individual variation in the applied details. This production system is itself remarkable. The ability to design a modular manufacturing process for ceramic figures of this complexity, maintain quality control across a workforce numbering in the thousands working simultaneously, and produce a final output of 8,000 figures with sufficient individual variation to avoid repetitive appearance. This represents a level of industrial organization extraordinary for the late 3rd century BCE anywhere in the world. But the specific puzzle that researchers focus on is the ethnic diversity of the faces. Among the 8,000 warriors, there are faces that do not look like what Chinese historical and artistic records would lead you to expect. Some figures have features that physical anthropologists describe as Caucasoid, high nose bridges, deep-set eyes, pronounced brow ridges, more consistent with Central Asian or even Western populations than with the Han Chinese populations of Shanxi. These features are not subtle variations within a single population. They are specific and recurring morphological characteristics that researchers have documented and debated for decades. The most widely cited explanation invokes the diversity of the Qin state's population. The Qin Empire incorporated territories and populations that had previously been separate states, and some of those populations had contact with Central Asian individuals through the Proto-Silk Road trade networks. If the craftsmen who made the army included workers from these diverse populations, or if the army was intended to represent the full diversity of the Qin military rather than just the Han Corps, the presence of faces with Central Asian features is explicable within known historical frameworks. This explanation is reasonable and probably correct for some portion of the anomalous faces. It does not fully account for the range of morphological variation that researchers document, and the specific proportions of non-East Asian appearing figures in the army have never been satisfactorily explained. The second major anomaly concerns the weapons. The terracotta army was not equipped with replica weapons, it was equipped with real ones. The warriors carry bronze swords, spears, crossbows, and arrowheads manufactured to the same standards as actual Qin military equipment, sharpened, functional, ready to use. More than 40,000 bronze arrowheads alone have been recovered from the pits. And those weapons, which have been in the ground for 22 centuries, are in a state of preservation that should not be possible. The bronze swords in particular have attracted the most sustained scientific attention. When recovered, they were not corroded in the way bronze objects buried in soil for 2,000 years are supposed to be corroded. Their surfaces were smooth and bright. Their edges, when tested, retained their sharpness. When metallurgists analyzed the surface chemistry, they found something unexpected: a thin layer of chromium oxide coating the bronze, uniformly applied across the entire surface. Chromium oxide passivates metal surfaces. It creates a protective barrier preventing the oxidative reactions that cause corrosion. It is the same chemical principle used in modern chromium plating, which was developed in the 20th century and is used today to protect automobile trim, bathroom fixtures, and industrial equipment. The chromium oxide on the terracotta army swords is not a coincidence of soil chemistry. The chromium content of the surrounding soil is not high enough to explain the coating. The coating is uniform across the blade surface in a way that natural deposition does not produce. And the coating is on the sword specifically, not on all the bronze objects in the pits. The evidence strongly suggests the swords were deliberately treated with a chromium-based surface coating before being placed in the pits. This would mean the craftsmen of the Qin state in the 3rd century BCE had discovered and were applying a metal protection technology that the Western industrial world would not develop for another 2,200 years. The math simply does not add up when you try to reconcile this with the conventional timeline of metallurgical development. The process of applying a chromium oxide coating using the chemistry available in 3rd century BCE China would have required specific knowledge of chromium compounds, their preparation, their application, and the treatment required to form the protective layer. We do not know where this knowledge came from, what form it took, or how it was transmitted. We do not know whether it was a deliberate discovery or a fortuitous consequence of a process undertaken for other reasons. We know only that the blades are there, that they are not corroded, that the protective layer is real and measurable, and that no other archaeological site from anywhere near this period has produced a comparable example of deliberate chromium surface treatment on bronze. The third anomaly is the mercury. The Shiji, the records of the Grand Historian, compiled by Sima Qian approximately a century after the emperor's death, states that the burial chamber beneath the large mound adjacent to the warrior pits contains rivers and seas of mercury made to flow by mechanical devices, the mercury representing the rivers and oceans of the empire. This account was long treated as the kind of mythological exaggeration ancient sources apply to the tombs of powerful rulers. In 2016, geochemical surveys of the burial mound area produced anomalous readings for mercury concentration in the soil that were not present in surrounding areas at comparable depths. The mercury concentrations were highest in the parts of the mound corresponding to the areas where the historical text placed rivers and seas. The pattern of the anomalous readings was not random. It corresponded in its distribution to the geographical layout of ancient China. The high mercury readings in the north, where the historical text places the northern river system. The high readings in the east, where the eastern sea would have been located. This finding does not prove that the burial chamber is intact and contains flowing mercury. It proves that large quantities of mercury are present in the mound soil in a pattern consistent with the historical description. Whether the mercury is the residue of deliberate placement in an intact chamber or the product of long-term seepage from a partially collapsed structure remains unknown. The burial chamber has never been excavated. The Chinese government has consistently maintained that the technology for excavating and preserving such a site does not yet exist at the standard required. The fate of the terracotta army's paint in the first moments of air exposure is the lesson that has never been forgotten. Until technology exists to excavate the chamber and stabilize everything within it before air exposure causes irreversible damage, it stays sealed. That decision is defensible, and it means that the most important burial chamber in Chinese history, described as containing an entire empire in miniature with mechanical rivers of mercury and a ceiling mapped with constellations in pearls, is still sealed beneath its mound in the Shanxi plain 22 centuries after the emperor was interred in it. We do not know what is inside. From the underground army of the first emperor, our investigation moves southward and much further back in time to a river valley in Sichuan province, where farmers discovered something in 1929 that took 60 years for Chinese archaeology to fully process, and that continues to generate new layers of bafflement with each new excavation season. Mystery 2. The Sanjingdui Bronzes, the civilization that shouldn't exist. In 1929, a farmer named Yan Daorong was working in his field near the town of Guanghan in Sichuan province when his hoe struck something hard in the soil. He dug carefully and found a cache of jade objects, rings and blades and decorated tablets, buried in a pit. The objects were clearly ancient and clearly of high quality, and they were clearly unlike anything he had seen from the region's known history. The discovery was noted in the regional archaeological record and then, to a significant degree, set aside. China in 1929 was not in a position to devote sustained attention to every unusual archaeological find. 57 years passed. In 1986, construction workers laying a brick factory foundation in the same general area of the Guanghan district struck 2 more pits. These pits contained objects that immediately changed the entire archaeological understanding of what Chinese civilization had been doing 3,000 years ago. The pits contained bronze objects, but not the ceremonial bronze vessels that archaeologists expected from Bronze Age Chinese cultures. The bronzes recovered from the 1986 pits were of a kind that had never been seen anywhere in the Chinese archaeological record. They were enormous, they were anatomically extraordinary, and they were completely unlike anything the surrounding historical and artistic tradition would have predicted. The most immediately striking objects are the masks. The Sanxingdui bronze masks are large. The largest is nearly 5 feet wide, with facial features that push far beyond any realistic human anatomy. The eyes protrude dramatically from the face on cylindrical stalks extending several inches outward from the eye socket. The ears are enormous, extending far above the crown of the head, shaped with a specificity and deliberateness that makes clear this is not artistic distortion for aesthetic effect, but a representation of a specific being whose physical form included projecting eyes and sky-reaching ears. The mouths are wide and pulled back in an expression that reads differently to different observers. Some see a smile, some see something more ambiguous, some see something entirely non-human. These are not artistic conventions of any Chinese artistic tradition we know. Chinese Bronze Age art from the Yellow River cultures, the Shang and Zhou dynasties, has its own conventions for representing human and divine faces, and they bear no resemblance to this. The Sanxingdui masks look in the plain assessment of every art historian who has studied them without a predetermined interpretation, like the faces of beings that the artists had either seen or were depicting from a very specific and very different conception of what divine or supernatural beings look like. The standing bronze figure recovered from the pits is equally extraordinary. It stands 6 feet tall on a base that brings its total height to nearly 13 feet, an extraordinary height for a bronze casting of this period anywhere in the world. It is a human figure in the most basic sense: 2 arms, 2 legs, a head, a torso. But the proportions are wrong for a human being in ways that are clearly deliberate. The hands are disproportionately large, the fingers extended and curved in a gesture that appears intentional, as if holding something that has since been removed or was never physically represented. The feet grip the top of the pedestal with a specificity that suggests the posture was important. The face looks outward with the same projecting eyes as the masks. The figures and masks were not found in place. They were found in the pits into which they had been deliberately placed, broken and burned, alongside thousands of other objects: elephant tusks, jade blades, cowrie shells, gold objects, smaller bronze figures, ceramic vessels. The burning and the deliberate breaking are themselves a mystery. Why would a civilization go to the extraordinary effort and expense of casting bronze objects of this scale and quality, objects requiring enormous technical sophistication and organizational resources, and then deliberately destroy them and bury them in a pit? The most widely accepted explanation is that the pits represent sacrifice pits, ceremonial deposits in which valuable objects were destroyed and buried as offerings to supernatural entities. This is a known ritual practice in various ancient cultures, and the combination of burning, breaking, and burial is consistent with it. But the scale of the sacrifice, the sheer quantity and quality of what was destroyed, suggests a civilizational crisis rather than a routine ritual. Something happened at Sanxingdui that caused its population to take their most sacred objects and destroy them and put them in the ground. We do not know what that something was. We do not know more fundamentally who these people were. The Sanxingdui culture occupied the Chengdu plain of Sichuan province from approximately 2800 BCE to 1100 BCE. It was a sophisticated Bronze Age civilization with writing that has not been decoded and a mythology that can only be partially inferred from the iconography of the bronzes. It was contemporaneous with the Shang dynasty of the Yellow River Valley. The Bronze Age culture that Chinese historical tradition acknowledges as foundational. The two cultures knew of each other as objects at Sanxingdui show contact with Shang bronze-making traditions, but they were fundamentally, completely, inexplicably different. In 2021, new excavation pits at the Sanxingdui site were opened, the first major new excavations since 1986. They produced more bronzes, more gold objects, more jade, and more evidence of the same mysterious practice of deliberate destruction and burial. They also produced a bronze box with a gold exterior, its contents sealed, which has been carefully extracted and whose contents are currently under analysis. Whatever is inside that box has been sealed in it for 3,000 years. The Sanxingdui civilization continues to withhold its explanations. The Sanxingdui civilization was buried by its own people and forgotten for 3,000 years. The next mystery we visit was buried by the Chinese government, deliberately within living memory. And the civilization it consumed is still there, perfectly preserved, waiting beneath the surface of a lake. Mystery 3. The underwater city of Xicheng, the Lion City beneath Qiandao Lake. In 1959, the government of the People's Republic of China made a decision that was, by the standards of mid-20th century infrastructure development, entirely unremarkable. The Xinan River in Zhejiang province was to be dammed, creating a reservoir to power a new hydroelectric plant. The reservoir would flood a valley. The valley contained farmland and two small towns, Xicheng and Wucheng. The approximately 300,000 people who lived in those towns and surrounding villages were relocated. The towns themselves were left where they stood, the dam was completed, the water rose, and Xicheng, a town that had been continuously inhabited for approximately 1400 years, founded in the Eastern Han dynasty, expanded and elaborated through the Tang and Song and Ming and Qing dynasties, into a substantial town of stone streets, carved archways and decorated gates, went under the surface of what became known as Qiandao Lake, the Thousand Island Lake, named for the hilltops that project above the waterline as islands in the new reservoir. Xicheng sank to a depth of between 26 and 40 meters, depending on the specific location within the original town plan. The water of the Xinan River flowing from the mountains is cold and relatively clean. The organic material in the town, wood, textiles, paper, did not survive the inundation. But the stones survived, the carved stone archways, the stone walls, the stone streets, the stone columns and decorative panels of the town's official buildings. All of this survived in the cold, dark water, and some of it survived better than it would have on the surface, because the absence of weather exposure and the consistent cold temperature of the deep water slowed the degradation processes that erode stone surfaces. The town was not formally rediscovered until 2001, when the local government, seeking to develop tourism around the Qiandao Lake Reservoir, organized the first organized dive expedition to document what was on the lake floor. What the divers found was startling in its completeness. Stone archways carved with elaborate fish and dragon decorations, wide stone streets still paved with their original flagstones. The stone lion sculptures that gave the city its other name, the Lion City, still in position, guarding the entrances to official buildings. Decorated stone walls, standing to their original height in some sections, their carved panels depicting scenes from Chinese mythology and official life, with a detail that had been protected from weather erosion by the cold water above them for 60 years. For reference, the preservation at Xicheng is comparable in certain respects to the preservation of Pompeii, a city frozen in time at a specific moment, its physical fabric largely intact, awaiting investigators who will eventually document it fully. The comparison has limits. Pompeii was destroyed by a sudden catastrophe. Xicheng was evacuated carefully, and its residents took what they could carry before the water rose. There was no sudden death, no panic. There was simply the gradual rising of cold water through stone streets until the surface closed over the last archway and the town passed out of the world of the living. What makes Xicheng a mystery rather than simply a remarkable archaeological site is the question of what it contained and what was left behind when the residents evacuated. 300,000 people were relocated in 1959. They took what they could. What was embedded in the architecture itself, carved stone panels, architectural fittings, objects too large or too fixed in position to be easily moved, stayed. And what was embedded in the architecture of a town occupied for 1,400 years includes everything that 14 centuries of Chinese provincial life deposited in its buildings, its cellars, and its official chambers. The systematic archaeological documentation of Xicheng is still in its early stages. The diving conditions are challenging: cold water, limited visibility at certain times of year, the depth requiring specialized equipment. What has been documented in expeditions conducted so far has been primarily photographic and video. The visual record of submerged streets and archways and lion sculptures that makes Xicheng one of the most visually striking archaeological sites in China. The systematic recovery and analysis of objects from the site has barely begun. We do not know what is inside the sealed buildings at the bottom of Qiandao Lake. The stone archways are documented. The stone lions are photographed. The contents of the buildings they connected remain unknown. Xicheng was deliberately submerged, and its location was always known. The next site was not submerged, and its location was always known. And yet, for reasons that remain entirely unexplained, it was completely invisible to history. No text mentions it, no record references it, no tradition preserves its name. 36 vast underground caverns carved with extraordinary precision, and the civilization that made them left no trace of ever having done so. Mystery 4. The Longyu Caves, 36 caverns with no history. In June of 1992, a farmer named Wu Anai in the village of Xi'an in Zhejiang province decided to drain a pond that had sat in his field for as long as anyone in the village could remember. The pond was considered useless, too deep and too murky to support fish farming, and local tradition held it was bottomless, which is why previous attempts to pump it dry had been abandoned. Wu Anai organized a group of villagers, rented a pump, and began removing the water. After 17 days of continuous pumping, the water level had dropped enough to reveal something extraordinary. Below the surface of what everyone had assumed was a natural pond was a stone ceiling. As the water level continued to drop, the ceiling resolved into the vaulted roof of an enormous cavern, its walls carved at a consistent angle, its floor covered in the silt of centuries of water accumulation, its surfaces decorated in a fish-scale chisel pattern that covered every inch of carved stone with the same precise incised marks. When Wu Anai and his neighbors descended into the cavern with lights, they found a space so large it dwarfed anything they had expected, a chamber the size of a sports arena, with columns left in place during the carving to support the ceiling, with alcoves and anterooms branching off the main space with staircases descending to lower levels. Then the neighboring farmers began draining their ponds. Each one that was pumped dry revealed another cavern below. In total, 36 caves were discovered beneath the pond-dotted landscape of the Xi'an area. 36 caverns of varying size, the largest covering approximately 4,000 square meters of floor area. All of them carved from the same red sandstone bedrock, all of them displaying the same distinctive fish-scale chisel pattern on every carved surface. The sheer volume of stone removed to create the Longyu Caves is staggering. Researchers have calculated that excavating the 36 caverns required the removal of approximately 1 million cubic meters of rock, 1 million cubic meters of sandstone, chipped out of the bedrock by hand tools and removed from the underground space through shafts or entrances that have not all been identified, deposited somewhere on or near the surface in a quantity that would have been visible for miles. The disposal of that much stone should itself have left a physical record in the landscape, a mountain of debris, compacted rubble deposits, the kind of geological signature that survives thousands of years. No such deposit has been identified near the caves. The fish scale pattern is its own puzzle. Every carved surface in all 36 caverns, the walls, the pillars, the ceilings, the staircases, carries the same pattern of overlapping curved incisions, each approximately 5 centimeters wide and 2 centimeters deep, arranged in rows running at a consistent angle of 45 degrees to the horizontal. The pattern is not random. It is not the organic result of a particular chisel technique producing incidental marks. It is deliberate and consistent across all 36 caverns in a way that proves unified design intent and consistent execution method across a workforce that must have numbered in the hundreds over an extended period. The math simply does not add up when you look for this project in the historical record. China is one of the most thoroughly documented civilizations in human history. The Chinese bureaucratic tradition maintained records of public works, tax levies for construction projects, labor conscription, materials requisition, and administrative decisions at a level of detail that has allowed historians to trace individual policy decisions across dynasties. A construction project requiring the excavation of 1 million cubic meters of stone and the creation of 36 caverns large enough to hold entire communities would have required imperial authorization, administrative management, labor coordination, and resource allocation that would have generated significant documentary evidence. None has been found. The Longyu Caves do not appear in any historical text. They are not mentioned in local gazetteers, the detailed records of local administration and history maintained by Chinese officials across the dynasties. They are not referenced in any imperial decree. They are not described by any traveler or official who passed through the region. This absence is more puzzling than the caves themselves. If the caves had been carved in the distant prehistoric past, before writing, before the bureaucratic state, the absence of documentation would be explicable, but the fish-scale carving technique and the structural organization of the caverns are consistent with the technology of historical Chinese civilization, not prehistoric. Researchers working from surface weathering and sediment deposits on the cave floors have estimated that the caves were created approximately 2,000 years ago, during the Qin or Han dynasty period, the same period that produced the Terracotta Army and many of the most thoroughly documented construction projects in Chinese history. A project of this scale in this period, in a region within the administrative territory of the Han Empire, should be in the record. It is not. We do not know who made the Longyu Caves, what they were for, or where the excavated stone went. Mystery 5. The Dunhuang Star Atlas. The oldest complete map of the sky. In 1900, a Taoist monk named Wang Yuanlu was clearing debris from Buddhist cave temples at the Mogao site near Dunhuang in Gansu province when he broke through a sealed wall and found a hidden chamber. Inside were approximately 40,000 manuscripts and printed documents, bundled and stacked in a space roughly 9 feet square, sealed behind the wall sometime around 1000 CE, and untouched for 900 years. The Dunhuang manuscripts are collectively one of the most important archive discoveries in the history of scholarship, a library covering an extraordinary range of subjects, languages, and traditions, preserved by the dry desert air and the sealed wall. Among the manuscripts is a scroll that researchers have determined was produced sometime in the 7th or 8th century CE, during the Tang dynasty. When unrolled and examined, it proved to contain a complete map of the visible night sky, every star visible to the naked eye from Dunhuang, plotted in its correct relative position and assigned to its correct constellation in the Chinese astronomical tradition. The atlas maps approximately 1,350 stars across 13 panels, covering the entire celestial sphere visible from the northern hemisphere. The next oldest comparable star atlas from anywhere in the world, Al-Sufi's Book of Fixed Stars, produced in Persia in the 10th century CE, was made 300 years later and maps fewer stars with less systematic methodology. The Dunhuang Star Atlas predates any comparable European astronomical atlas by centuries. It is the oldest complete star catalogue in the world in the sense of mapping the visible sky systematically with consistent positional information. What makes the atlas scientifically remarkable is not merely its age, but its accuracy. When modern astronomers took the star positions plotted in the atlas and compared them with calculated stellar positions for the period of its creation, they found positional accuracy of genuinely impressive quality. Errors, in most cases, of only a few degrees, which is remarkably good for naked-eye observation without telescopic instruments. Achieving this accuracy across 1,350 stars required a long-term observational program, careful record-keeping, and a computational system for translating observations into the coordinate system used in the atlas. None of these things are impossible for Tang Dynasty Chinese astronomy. The astronomical tradition was sophisticated and empirically rigorous by this period, but the specific procedures and calculations that produce the atlas have not been reconstructed from surviving records. To understand the full significance of the atlas, consider the environment in which it was made. The Tang dynasty at its peak was one of the most cosmopolitan civilizations in the world. Chang'an, the capital, was a city of perhaps 1 million people, the largest city on earth at the time, hosting merchants, scholars, monks, diplomats and travelers from Central Asia, Persia, India, the Byzantine Empire, Korea, and Japan. The state maintained a sophisticated astronomical bureau, the Taishiju, staffed by professional astronomers whose primary responsibilities were calendrical, ensuring the accuracy of the official calendar on which agricultural scheduling, ritual timing, and political legitimacy all depended. The Star Atlas was the product of this institutional environment. But institutions change, funding shifts, bureaucratic priorities evolve. The scrolls that traveled from Chang'an to Dunhuang along the Silk Road were moving from the center of the empire to its edge, and from an era of institutional support to an era of uncertainty. The ceiling of the library cave at Mogao around 1000 CE corresponds to a period of regional instability in which the Dunhuang oasis changed hands between Chinese, Tibetan, and Uyghur political authorities. Someone, a monk, a librarian, a local official, made the decision to seal the manuscripts behind a plastered wall rather than allow them to be destroyed or dispersed. That decision is why we have the Star Atlas today. The atlas sits in the British Library in London, where it has been since Aurel Stein purchased it from Wang Yuanlu in 1907. The specific observational program that generated its 1,350 star positions has never been fully reconstructed. We have the map. We do not have the story of how the map was made. Mystery 6. The Oracle Bones, a writing system without a visible beginning. In the 1890s, scholars in Beijing noticed that a common ingredient in traditional Chinese medicine, dragon bones, sold in pharmacies as a ground powder for therapeutic purposes, sometimes bore strange markings that looked like writing. Dragon bones were in fact ancient animal bones and tortoise shells, much of them sourced from farmers in Henan province who found them in the soil. The markings on the bones turned out to be script, Chinese writing, or rather the ancestor of Chinese writing, inscribed in an archaic form clearly related to classical Chinese script. The bones were oracle bones, the physical remains of a divination practice of the Shang dynasty, the Bronze Age culture of the Yellow River Valley that ruled China from approximately 1600 BCE to 1046 BCE. The Shang royal court employed official diviners who would take a bone, typically the shoulder blade of an ox or a plastron from a tortoise, heat it until it cracked, interpret the pattern of the cracks as an answer to a specific question, and inscribe both the question and the answer on the bone. The questions covered everything: whether the harvest would be good, whether a military campaign would succeed, whether the ancestor spirits were causing a specific disaster. They also covered the mundane, a king asking the bones whether his toothache is the responsibility of a specific ancestor, a king asking whether his wife's pregnancy will produce a boy or a girl. The bones recorded it all because the purpose of divination is not history, and divination does not filter for relevance. Approximately 200,000 oracle bone fragments have been recovered from the Anyang site in Henan province, the capital of the late Shang dynasty. Of the approximately 5,000 individual graphs identified in the oracle bone script, roughly a third have been deciphered through their relationship to later Chinese characters. The readable bones have provided an extraordinary amount of information about Shang social organization, religion, and political structure that would otherwise have been entirely lost. But the puzzle that researchers have been unable to resolve is the one that confronts any serious student of the oracle bones from the very beginning. The script appears in the archaeological record fully formed. There is no developmental sequence. There is no proto-script, no series of gradually more sophisticated symbol systems leading from pictographic representations toward the standardized graph forms of the oracle bone script. The oracle bone graphs are complex, standardized, and grammatically functional from their first appearance in the record. They represent a writing system that already works, that has already solved the problems of representing the phonology and morphology of the Chinese language in a consistent, learnable, standardized form. The absence of a developmental sequence is particularly puzzling in comparison with every other ancient writing system that has been studied. Sumerian cuneiform can be traced from its earliest pictographic origins through a series of stages of increasing abstraction over several centuries. Egyptian hieroglyphics similarly show a developmental trajectory from early pictographic forms. The oracle bone script has no visible prehistory in the Chinese archaeological record. It appears at the Anyang site apparently complete. The standard explanation proposes that the developmental stages did occur, but on a perishable medium, bamboo slips or silk, that has not survived the millennia. The oracle bones themselves were used for divination rather than ordinary administrative or literary purposes, and the full complexity of the script's developmental history may be encoded in records that rotted away. This explanation is plausible and probably correct. It means that the evidence for the early development of Chinese writing is gone, and the writing system as we know it from its first surviving records is already mature. What the oracle bones give us beyond the mystery of their sudden appearance is something more intimate. The specific texture of royal Shang dynasty life in extraordinary, unfiltered detail. The bones give us the names of Shang kings and their consorts and their officials. They give us the ritual calendar of the court, which ancestral spirits were propitiated on which days, what offerings were made. They give us a portrait of a royal court that was simultaneously exercising extraordinary political power and consulting cracked bones about toothaches. It is the detail that makes the 3,000-year-old Shang king into a person, a human being with dental problems and anxieties about his wife's pregnancy, rather than a historical abstraction. And it is the detail that makes the sudden appearance of the script that recorded all of this so difficult to accept as simply the result of a perishable developmental sequence we have not found. Mystery 7. The Tarim Basin mummies, a population that defies explanation. In the Xinjiang region of far northwestern China, in the bone-dry desert basins of the Tarim and Dzungarian depressions, some of the most arid conditions on Earth have been preserving organic material in the soil for thousands of years. Explorers moving through the region in the late 19th and early 20th centuries began finding human remains in the desert, mummified bodies preserved by extreme dryness rather than any deliberate mummification process, resting in graves that the shifting sand had exposed. The bodies were ancient, and they were not what anyone expected to find in the deserts of western China. The Tarim mummies have light hair, blonde, reddish-brown, dark brown. They have faces that physical anthropologists describe as Caucasoid rather than Mongoloid. They are tall, with the tallest male mummies measure over 6 feet. And they are clothed in textiles that are not Chinese in their weaving technique. The Churchen man, one of the most studied of the Tarim mummies, is approximately 3,200 years old, roughly 6 feet tall, and wore tartan-patterned woolen clothing of a weave type that European textile historians associate with Celtic-speaking peoples of Bronze Age Europe. He was buried with other individuals who appear to be socially and genetically related, and the grave goods associated with them speak of a culture with specific ritual practices and specific technological capabilities that are neither Chinese nor clearly identifiable as any other known culture of the period. When you stand before the best preserved of these mummies in the Xinjiang Regional Museum in Urumqi, the experience is not what you expect from a prehistoric exhibit. You are not looking at desiccated bone and wrapped remains. You are looking at faces, The Lulan beauty, approximately 4,000 years old, has a face with a serenity of expression that seems more like sleep than death. The Churchen man's face is large and red-bearded, his forehead proportioned in a way that seems European. The Hami mummy is a woman with long, remarkably preserved, reddish-brown hair, arranged in a style that seems almost contemporary. These are people. They are 3,000 to 4,000 years old, and they look like people. The genetic analysis of the Tarim mummies, conducted with increasing sophistication as ancient DNA technology has improved, has produced results that are genuinely remarkable. A major study published in 2021 based on genome-wide analysis of 13 Tarim Basin mummies found that the population they represent does not show the genetic mixture of Eastern and Western Eurasian ancestry that characterizes most ancient populations along the Silk Road corridor. Instead, they appear to be a genetically isolated population with strong affinities to the ancient North Eurasians, a prehistoric population that contributed genetics to many later Eurasian groups but that has no strong living descendants. The Tarim mummy population looks genomically like a relic of a very ancient Eurasian population that maintained its isolation for an extraordinary period while developing its own distinctive culture in the Tarim Basin. This finding reframes the mystery. The original question was, how did Caucasian-appearing people get to northwestern China 3,000 years ago? The genetic evidence suggests the framing was wrong. The Tarim Basin population was not a group of people who arrived from somewhere else. They were a population that had been in or near the region for an extraordinarily long time, maintaining genetic isolation from surrounding populations, and that developed its culture, its distinctive textiles, and its ritual practices in relative independence from both the Eastern civilizations of China and the Western civilizations of the Eurasian steppe. This reframing resolves some questions and opens others. If the Tarim Basin population was genuinely isolated, the striking similarities between their textiles and those of Bronze Age European cultures, the tartan patterns, the specific weave structures, are either coincidence, evidence of a very ancient shared technological tradition that predates the divergence of the populations, or evidence of occasional contact along routes we have not fully mapped. The genetic isolation argues against frequent contact. The textile similarities argue for some kind of connection. How to reconcile these two pieces of evidence is a problem that researchers are still working through. What is certain is that the Tarim mummies represent a population of people who lived for thousands of years in the desert basins of what is now northwestern China, who were physically and genetically distinct from their neighbors in every direction, and whose full story is still being assembled from ancient DNA and the extraordinarily well-preserved contents of their graves. Mystery 8. The South-Pointing Chariot. A differential gear from 220 CE. In the year 220 CE, during the chaotic period following the collapse of the Han dynasty, a government official named Ma Jun presented to the court of the Cao Wei state a mechanical device of extraordinary sophistication. The device was a two-wheeled chariot pulled by a horse, on which stood a wooden figure of a person with one arm extended pointing outward. The extended arm of the figure always pointed in the same direction, south, regardless of which direction the chariot was facing or traveling. The figure rotated automatically as the chariot turned, always correcting its orientation to maintain the southward pointing. It required no magnetic compass. It required no astronomical observation. It was purely mechanical, and it worked. The south-pointing chariot achieved its constant directional orientation through a differential gear mechanism. The two wheels of the chariot were connected by a gearing system that measured the relative rotation of the left wheel against the right. When the chariot traveled in a straight line, both wheels turned at the same speed, and the gearing transmitted no corrective motion to the pointing figure. When the chariot turned right, the right wheel traveled a shorter distance than the left wheel, and the differential in rotation between the two wheels was transmitted through the gearing to rotate the pointing figure to the left by exactly the corresponding amount, cancelling the turn's effect on the figure's direction. The figure tracked true south using only the geometry of the chariot's own motion. The differential gear is the same mechanical principle used in every motor vehicle on the road today. The rear axle differential of a modern car allows the two rear wheels to rotate at different speeds when the car turns, preventing the wheels from skidding. The mathematical principle is identical to that of the south-pointing chariot. The differential gear was, in the Western engineering tradition, developed in the 16th century and refined through the Industrial Revolution. In the Chinese tradition, it was apparently operating in a road vehicle in the early 3rd century CE, more than 1,000 years earlier. The south-pointing chariot is not described in technical detail by Ma Jun's contemporaries. We do not have a surviving blueprint or specification from his period. What we have is the historical record that the device existed, was demonstrated to the court, and worked. The reconstruction of how it worked, and the proposal that it used a differential gear mechanism, was made by modern engineers working backward from the device's described behavior. The first convincing mechanical reconstruction was produced in 1947 by the British historian of Chinese science Joseph Needham and collaborators, who showed that a differential gear system was the only mechanism consistent with the device's described function that could have been manufactured from wood using 3rd century Chinese metalworking and woodworking technology. The device points toward a broader question about the history of Chinese technology that historians of science have been discussing for decades. China had, by the 3rd century CE, independently arrived at a mechanical principle that European technology would not develop until the 16th century. It had paper 1,000 years before Europe. It had printing 5 centuries before Gutenberg. It had gunpowder 3 centuries before it reached Europe. It had the magnetic compass before the European age of exploration. And yet none of these inventions, individually or collectively, produced in China what the European scientific revolution and industrial revolution produced in Europe. This is known in the history of science as the Needham question, and it remains one of the most important unresolved questions in world history. The south-pointing chariot, invented and then lost, the knowledge of how to build it disappearing within 2 centuries of its inventor's death, is one of the clearest examples of the pattern that the Needham question points to. Invention without sustained development, discovery without systematic exploitation, the most remarkable mechanical insight of its era, made once and then allowed to disappear. Mystery 9. The Forbidden City. Ice roads, lightning, and the numbers that govern heaven. The Forbidden City of Beijing was built between 1406 and 1420 CE under the supervision of the Yongle Emperor, the 3rd emperor of the Ming dynasty. It covers 72 hectares, contains approximately 9,000 individual rooms arranged in 900 buildings, and was home to 24 successive emperors and their households until the fall of the Qing dynasty in 1912. It is the largest palace complex in the world and one of the best preserved examples of traditional Chinese architecture anywhere. The construction logistics are well documented in their administrative outlines. The Yongle Emperor mobilized an estimated 100,000 craftsmen and 1 million laborers over the 14 years of primary construction. Materials were sourced from across the empire, timber from the tropical forests of Yunnan and Sichuan, transported hundreds of miles by river and road, stone from quarries in the mountains near Beijing, marble from Fangshan, glazed tiles from kilns in Suzhou. The specific mystery concerns the largest stones. The Forbidden City's courtyard floors and certain interior features are made from enormous stone slabs, the largest weighing approximately 120 tons. Moving a 120-ton stone slab from a mountain quarry to the construction site in the center of the city, over roads that could not support that weight, using the technology available in the early 15th century, is a problem that researchers analyzed extensively. A study published in 2013 revealed how it was done, and the method is both ingenious and staggering in its implications. The stones were moved in winter. Workers would pour water onto the road surface ahead of the moving sled, carrying each stone, creating a continuous layer of ice. The stone was then pulled forward on the ice by teams of men. The ice reduced friction to a level that made movement possible. Pulling a sled across ice requires approximately 1/30th the force of pulling the same sled across dry ground. The workers created a temporary ice road by continuously reapplying water ahead of the moving stone. The calculations performed by the 2013 research team suggested that approximately 2,000 men pulling on ropes could move a 120-ton stone slab on ice at a walking pace. Multiply that by the number of large stones in the Forbidden City's construction. The scale of the logistics is staggering, and the organizational intelligence required to plan and execute the ice road operation, to time the winter correctly, to have water available in sufficient quantities along the entire route, to coordinate the pulling teams with the watering teams, is itself impressive. But what the ice road story tells us is that the builders of the Forbidden City did not have a secret technology. They had an extraordinary application of known physical principles and an organizational capacity that could mobilize 2,000 people for a single stone. And then, in 1421, 1 year after the completion of the largest palace complex in the world, lightning struck the 3 central throne halls and they were destroyed by fire. The Yongle Emperor, whose entire reign had been building toward this capital, watched his throne halls burn within months of moving into them. He took this as a possible sign of divine disapproval. The concept of the mandate of heaven implied that natural disasters could indicate heaven was withdrawing its support from a dynasty, and a lightning strike on the new throne halls so soon after completion was the kind of omen that Confucian scholar officials would make the most of in their arguments against the expensive northern capital project they had always opposed. The throne halls were rebuilt. But the political aftermath of the fire, the reassertion of Confucian conservative influence, the cancellation of the Zhenghe voyages, the imprisonment of several eunuch officials associated with the capital building program represents a pivot point in Ming dynasty history whose full consequences are still debated. A different response to the 1421 fire might have produced a different political trajectory. The fire happened, the interpretation was made, and the world went the way it went. The number 999 is also worth noting. The Forbidden City is traditionally described as having 9,999 rooms, one short of the 10,000 rooms considered the perfect number reserved for heaven itself. The emperor, however divine his political status, could not claim the number that belonged to heaven. 9,999 was the mortal equivalent of the divine 10,000. Whether the actual room count is exactly 9,999 is debated, but the numerical symbolism embedded in the design is clear and deliberate. The entire spatial organization of the complex is structured around the number 9, 9 gateways, dimensions divisible by 9, the 9-9 symbolism of the room count, because 9 is the highest single digit, the number closest to the divine, while remaining within the human range. The mathematics of the Forbidden City is as deliberately constructed as its architecture. Mystery 10. The Voyages of Zhenghe. The fleet that turned back. Between 1405 and 1433, the Ming dynasty eunuch admiral Zheng He led 7 extraordinary naval expeditions into the Indian Ocean and beyond, commanding fleets so large that the European age of exploration that followed them by barely a generation looks modest in comparison. The largest of Zheng He's treasure fleets reportedly consisted of over 300 vessels, including the enormous Baoquan treasure ships, whose dimensions, if the historical accounts are accurate, exceeded anything the European maritime tradition would produce for another century. Zheng He himself was a Muslim, born into a Hui Muslim family in Yunnan province. His original name was Ma He, and his father and grandfather had both made the Hajj to Mecca. He was captured as a child during the Ming conquest of Yunnan, taken into imperial service, and rose through the eunuch ranks to become one of the most trusted advisors of the Yongle Emperor. His background, a Muslim from a family of pilgrims, serving as the admiral of an empire maintaining formal diplomatic relationships with Muslim states across the Indian Ocean, was directly relevant to the success of the treasure voyages, which cultivated relationships with Muslim rulers in the Persian Gulf, East Africa, and Southeast Asia. His personal background made him an extraordinarily effective diplomat for exactly the regions the voyages were visiting. The fleets visited the Persian Gulf, the Red Sea, the eastern coast of Africa as far south as Mozambique, and various ports throughout Southeast Asia and the Indian subcontinent. They brought Chinese goods, silk, porcelain, and manufactured items, and returned with exotic products and tribute delegations from the rulers they encountered. Giraffes for the imperial zoo, ostriches, zebras, diplomatic envoys, and the formal submission of foreign rulers to the nominal suzerainty of the Chinese emperor. The physical evidence of the voyages is substantial and continues to grow. Chinese porcelain of the early Ming period has been recovered from archaeological sites along the entire East African coast, from ports in the Red Sea, from locations in Southeast Asia consistent with the documented route. A stone tablet erected by Zheng He's fleet in Sri Lanka, recording donations made to local temples in 3 languages, Chinese, Tamil, and Persian, was found in Galle in 1911 and is now in the Colombo National Museum. And then, in 1433, after the 7th voyage, the expedition stopped. The conservative Confucian scholar official class that dominated the bureaucracy viewed the eunuch-led maritime expeditions as a waste of imperial resources and a threat to the social order. The expeditions were cancelled, the great ships were allowed to rot in harbour. The logs and charts of the voyages were ordered destroyed by the Minister of War, Liu Daxia, who reportedly said that the voyages had been wasteful adventures and that the records of them deserved to be burned. Some records were burned, others were hidden by bureaucrats who understood their historical value. The full documentary record of Zheng He's voyages was severely damaged by this deliberate destruction. China had, in the early 15th century, the naval technology, the organizational capacity, and the practical experience to establish contact with any part of the accessible world. The choice not to use that capacity, the decision to cancel the voyages, burn the records and turn inward, is one of the most consequential choices in world history. The world that would have resulted from continued and expanded Chinese maritime engagement in the 15th and 16th centuries would have been fundamentally different from the one that actually developed, in which European maritime powers filled the vacuum left by the Chinese withdrawal. We cannot know what that alternative world would have looked like. We can only look at the rotting hulks in the harbour and the destroyed records and the unanswered question of what would have happened if Liu Daxia had left the logs unburned. Mystery 11. Zhang Heng's seismoscope. The earthquake detector from 132 CE. In the year 132 CE, the Han Dynasty polymath Zhang Heng presented to the imperial court a device he called the Hufeng Didong Yi, the instrument for inquiring into the wind and the shaking of the earth. The device was a bronze vessel approximately 8 feet in diameter, shaped like a wine jar, its surface decorated with mountain ridges and tortoise and bird designs. Around its upper rim, equally spaced, were 8 dragon sculptures, each facing a different cardinal or intermediate direction. Below each dragon's mouth sat a bronze toad with its mouth open. Inside the vessel was the working mechanism. Zhang Heng demonstrated the device by showing that when operating correctly, a ball would fall from the mouth of one of the 8 dragons into the open mouth of the toad below it, indicating the direction from which an earthquake tremor had originated, without any shaking of the device itself being perceptible to the people around it. The mechanism would detect tremors too faint for human senses to register and identify their directional origin. For several years after its installation, the imperial court was skeptical. The device would occasionally release a ball when no one had felt any shaking, and the court assumed it was malfunctioning. But on each occasion, investigation confirmed that an earthquake had occurred in the direction indicated by the fallen ball, at a distance too great for tremors to have reached the capital with enough force to be felt by humans. The most dramatic confirmation came when the device indicated a tremor to the northwest, and several days later word arrived from Longxi province that a significant earthquake had occurred there. The detection of earthquakes too distant to be felt at the instrument's location is genuinely extraordinary by any standard. Modern seismographs, instruments for detecting and recording ground motion, were first developed in the late 19th century. The principle they use is essentially inertial, a mass that remains stationary while the ground moves around it, the relative motion between the suspended mass and the moving ground being recorded as the seismic signal. The mechanism by which Zhang Heng's device worked was not documented in sufficient detail by his contemporaries for modern researchers to reconstruct it with certainty, and no surviving example exists. Multiple reconstructions have been attempted. The leading theory proposes an inverted pendulum mechanism, a rod balanced on a pivot inside the jar, positioned so that it would fall toward the direction of an incoming seismic wave, its motion amplified by a system of levers to release the ball from the appropriate dragon's mouth. Experimental models built on this principle have demonstrated that an inverted pendulum is sensitive enough to detect small ground motions imperceptible to humans, and that it naturally falls in the direction of the approaching wavefront. This mechanism is physically consistent with Zhang Heng's descriptions and with the documented behavior of the device. Zhang Heng's seismoscope appears in Chinese historical texts and is mentioned in later encyclopedias as a remarkable invention. It does not appear to have been reproduced or maintained after his death in 139 CE. The knowledge of how to build it, the specific calibration of the internal mechanism, the materials and tolerances required for it to function correctly, was apparently not transmitted. 200 years after Zhang Heng, Chinese texts describe his device with admiration, but without the technical detail required to rebuild it. The invention that could have given Chinese civilization a 1500-year head start in seismological detection was made once, demonstrated successfully, and then lost. Mystery 12. The 9 Cauldrons of Yu. The lost objects of supreme power. In the mythology and early history of China, there are 9 bronze cauldrons, Ding, that represent the supreme legitimacy of Chinese rulership. The 9 tripod cauldrons of the Great Yu were cast, according to tradition, by the legendary Emperor Yu, who tamed the Great Flood and founded the Xia dynasty. The dynasty that, if historical rather than legendary, would be the earliest Chinese dynasty, predating the Shang by several centuries. Yu commanded that the 9 cauldrons be cast from bronze, contributed as tribute by the 9 provinces of the empire, each cauldron inscribed with the strange and marvelous things found in each province, the monsters, the spirits, the geographical wonders, so that the people would know what to beware of when they travelled. The 9 cauldrons were not merely ritual objects. They were, in Chinese political theology, the material embodiment of the mandate of heaven, the divine authorization to rule. Each new dynasty that succeeded the previous one received the 9 cauldrons along with the transfer of power. The legitimacy of a dynasty's rule was in some sense constituted by its possession of the cauldrons. When the Zhou dynasty replaced the Shang, the Zhou received the cauldrons. When the states of the Warring States period rose and fell, their rulers sought to claim or question the possession of the cauldrons by the weakening Zhou king. The question of who held the cauldrons was, in this tradition, the question of who had the right to rule China. The last historically attested location of the 9 cauldrons was at the court of the Zhou dynasty in approximately 256 BCE, when the Zhou state was finally extinguished by the expanding Qin. After that point, the historical record is silent. The Qin, which unified China under the first emperor in 221 BCE, does not record having taken possession of the 9 cauldrons. Remarkable, given that possession of the cauldrons was in theory the physical proof of legitimate rule, and Qin Shi Huang would have had every political reason to claim them if he had them. The cauldrons are not mentioned in the inventories of the Han dynasty that followed, nor in any subsequent dynastic record as physical objects in the imperial possession. The most widely held theory is that the cauldrons were thrown into a river, either the Xi River or the Peng River, accounts differ, sometime in the late Zhou period. The historical texts do record an account of a cauldron being fished out of the Xi River by agents of Qin Shi Huang, who had been told that a cauldron lay in its depths. But as the cauldron was being hoisted out of the water, a dragon is said to have bitten through the rope and the cauldron fell back in. This story has the quality of a legend constructed to explain why the first emperor, who conquered everything, did not possess the 9 cauldrons. River surveys using modern sonar and underwater cameras have been conducted at various proposed locations along the Xi River and its tributaries. No candidates matching the 9 cauldrons have been found. They remain, after 2,500 years, either the most important missing objects in Chinese history or the most important objects that may never have existed, as the tradition claims, which is a different kind of mystery, and perhaps a more interesting one. Mystery 13. The Longyu Script and the Chu Silk Manuscript. Locked Traditions. The Chu Silk Manuscript is the oldest illustrated silk manuscript ever found anywhere in the world. Recovered from a Warring States period tomb at Changsha in Hunan province and dated to approximately 300 BCE, it consists of text organized in 3 sections, written in archaic Chinese, surrounding a central illustrated panel. The text sections deal with astronomical and calendrical matters, the relationship between the 12 months of the year, and the activities appropriate to each, the consequences of performing certain actions in the wrong month, the cosmic forces associated with each period. What makes the manuscript extraordinary is the illustrated panel at its center. 12 figures are depicted around the border, 1 for each month. These figures are not human, they are creatures with multiple heads carrying specific attributes, tools, objects, animal companions, that appear to be significant but have not been matched to any known iconographic tradition. Their bodies are described and decorated with a specificity that suggests they were not invented for this manuscript but were recognizable entities drawn from a tradition that the manuscript's original readers would have understood without explanation. They have not been identified. After more than 80 years of scholarship on the Chu Silk manuscript, the 12 monthly creatures remain unmatched to any figure in the surviving textual or artistic tradition of the Chu state or any of its contemporary cultures. The broader artistic tradition of Chu, the state that occupied the middle Yangtze River Valley, is distinctive from the northern Chinese states in ways that suggest a genuinely different cultural substrate. Chu bronzes have a different aesthetic from the Shang and Zhou bronzes of the Yellow River Valley. Chu lacquerware depicts mythological scenes with creatures that appear in no other Chinese artistic tradition. The Lady and the Phoenix, recovered from a tomb at Changsha, shows a slender woman in flowing robes standing beneath a dragon and a phoenix engaged in a kind of contest above her. The elongated proportions of the figure, the specific stylization of the dragon and phoenix, and the overall compositional approach have no close parallel in northern Chinese art of the same period. They represent a different aesthetic tradition, vigorous, sophisticated, producing art of extraordinary quality, that was largely absorbed into the mainstream of Chinese art after the Qin conquest of Chu in 223 BCE. What the Chu artistic tradition preserves, in its distinctive aesthetic and unfamiliar mythology, is evidence of the cultural diversity of the pre-imperial Chinese world. Before Qin Shi Huang unified China and imposed cultural standardization, the regions of what would become China were home to a range of cultures that were related but significantly different in their specific religious practices, artistic traditions, and mythological frameworks. The standardization that came with unification reduced that cultural diversity, absorbing the specific traditions of states like Chu into a unified mainstream that preserved some elements and lost others. The 12 unnamed creatures of the Chu Silk manuscript are among the things that were not preserved. The manuscript is the only window into a tradition whose full context is gone, showing us creatures without names, without stories, without the meaning that the people who drew them understood completely. Mystery 14. The Fuxi and Nuer Flood Myth, China's Global Resonances. In the creation mythology of ancient China, the universe begins in chaos. From the chaos emerge the first divine beings, and among the most important is a pair, Fuxi and Nuer, depicted throughout Chinese art, from the Han dynasty onward, as human from the waist up and serpentine below, their tails intertwined. Fuxi is credited with teaching humanity the skills of civilization, fishing, hunting, animal domestication, cooking, and most importantly, the creation of the 8 trigrams, the foundational symbols of Chinese cosmological thought underlying the I Ching. Nuer is credited with creating human beings from yellow clay and with repairing the heavens after a catastrophic disaster caused a pillar of the sky to break and the world to be flooded. The flood. Almost every ancient civilization in the world has a flood myth, a narrative in which the world was once destroyed by water and a small remnant of humanity survived to repopulate it. Mesopotamian mythology has the flood of Utnapishtim, which the Epic of Gilgamesh records. The Hebrew Bible has Noah, the Greek tradition has Deucalion, the Hindu tradition has Manu, the Mesoamerican traditions have various flood narratives, the Pacific Island traditions have flood stories, and China has Nua repairing the broken sky and Fuxi surviving the flood and repopulating the earth. The similarity of flood narratives across cultures that had no demonstrable contact with each other is one of the oldest puzzles in comparative mythology. The standard explanations range from the historical, a real catastrophic flood event in the distant past preserved in oral tradition across multiple cultures, to the psychological. The flood is a universal metaphor for chaos and destruction that human minds independently produce. To the diffusionist, the narratives spread from a single source through cultural contact routes we have not fully mapped. None is complete, and none has achieved consensus. What adds a specific layer to the Chinese case is the imagery of Fuxi and Nua themselves. The intertwined serpents, depicted specifically as tails coiling around each other in a helical double twist configuration in the most detailed Han Dynasty representations, produce an image that modern observers immediately recognize: the double helix. The visual resemblance between the intertwined serpentine tails of Fuxi and Nua and the structure of DNA as revealed by Watson and Crick in 1953 is striking enough that it has been noted and published by multiple researchers. This interpretation is almost certainly reaching beyond what the evidence supports. The double helix is a shape that appears naturally in many contexts, and the probability of independent metaphorical use is much higher than the probability of ancient knowledge of molecular biology. But the observation is made and the visual resonance is real. The deeper puzzle it points toward: why do civilizations as geographically separated as ancient China and ancient Mesopotamia tell structurally similar stories about a divine pair who survived a flood and repopulated the world, remains one of the genuinely interesting unsolved questions in the study of human mythology. Modern geology provides a partial answer. At the end of the last ice age, approximately 12,000 years ago, global sea levels rose by approximately 120 meters as the glaciers melted. In East Asia specifically, the Yellow Sea and the East China Sea were largely dry land during the glacial maximum, forming a vast coastal plain connecting the Korean peninsula to the Chinese mainland. This was a productive, habitable landscape, and it was gradually inundated as the glaciers melted. The loss of these coastal plains, particularly if any episodes of rapid inundation occurred, would have been experienced by populations living there as catastrophic flooding on a civilizational scale. Whether the stories of Fuxi and Nua preserve a memory, distorted and mythologized, over 10,000 years of oral transmission of the actual inundation of the East Asian coastal plains, and this question cannot be answered definitively with current evidence. But the geological flooding was real, and the populations experiencing it were real, and the tradition of telling the story of the flood has survived to the present day. Mystery 15. The Great Wall Beyond the Wall. Mongolia's Hidden Ramparts. The Great Wall of China, in the popular imagination, is a single structure, the famous crenellated rampart that snakes across the mountain ridges north of Beijing. This image is both approximately correct and substantially misleading. The Great Wall is not one structure. It is a collection of walls, ramparts, ditches, and watchtowers constructed by different Chinese states and dynasties over approximately 2,000 years, following different routes, built from different materials, serving different strategic purposes. The famous sections north of Beijing are largely the work of the Ming dynasty, rebuilt and extended between the 14th and 17th centuries. What is much less well known is that there are walls in the Great Wall tradition that are not in China at all. In the territory of modern Mongolia, north of what is currently the Chinese border, there are the remnants of ancient wall systems extending for hundreds of kilometers across the steppe landscape. These walls are smaller in scale than the famous Ming period sections. Earthen ramparts rather than stone and brick constructions, some degraded to barely more than a raised line in the grass. But they are real, they are numerous, and the question of who built them has not been satisfactorily answered. Satellite imagery and ground surveys conducted in recent decades have documented several distinct wall systems in Mongolia. Some can be plausibly attributed to the extension of known Chinese defensive constructions. The Han Dynasty did build walls well north of the modern Chinese border as part of its containment strategy for the Xiongnu Confederation. But others do not fit the known Han construction programs. They follow routes that do not correspond to known Han strategic priorities. They are built in styles that differ from Han construction techniques, and some of them appear, based on their spatial relationship to other archaeological features, to have been built not to keep nomads out of China, but to demarcate territory within the steppe. Walls built by a steppe power for its own internal organizational purposes. The Mongolian walls have not been systematically excavated, and dating earthen ramparts without associated datable material is difficult. The scholarly consensus is that the walls represent a complex history of multiple construction episodes by multiple different powers across a long period, some Chinese, some Xiongnu, some from later nomadic empires whose specific identities remain unclear. The full picture of who built which walls, in which order, for what purpose, and what those walls tell us about the organization of steppe civilizations that left far fewer written records than their sedentary Chinese neighbors, is not established. The Xiongnu Confederation, the primary northern enemy of the Han Dynasty, was not a random collection of horse-riding raiders. It was a sophisticated political entity with hierarchical leadership, a tribute system, and diplomatic relations with the Han court. The wall evidence in Mongolia suggests the organizational capacity to undertake large-scale construction projects. The walls are there. The history behind them is still being assembled from the landscape itself, one survey and excavation at a time. Mystery 16. The Yonaguni Monument. Stone steps at the edge of the Pacific. In 1986, a Japanese dive instructor named Kihachiro Aratake was exploring the waters off the southwestern tip of the Ryukyu archipelago, the chain of islands running between the southern tip of Japan and the northern coast of Taiwan, when he encountered a formation on the seafloor that has been generating controversy ever since. The Yonaguni Monument, as it has come to be called, is a large underwater rock formation approximately 25 meters below the surface, roughly 100 meters long and 45 meters wide. Its surface features a series of step-like terraces, flat platforms, vertical walls, and what appear to be regularly shaped angles and corners. The question that has not been resolved in nearly 40 years of investigation is whether the Yonaguni Monument is a natural geological formation or a human-made structure. This is not as simple a question as it might seem. Yonaguni is composed of sandstone, which naturally fractures along flat plains and at right angles, two features that make the regular terraces and corners of the monument entirely consistent with natural geological processes. The Japanese geologist Masaki Kimura, who has studied the monument extensively and has argued strongly for a human-made origin, points to specific features he believes cannot be explained geologically. A large, isolated rectangular rock he calls an arch, a triangular depression he calls the star shape, tool marks he believes he can identify on certain surfaces. Geologists who have studied the same features have reached different conclusions. The waters around Yonaguni have not been systematically excavated in the archaeological sense. The dive expeditions that have visited have been primarily observational and photographic. The physical recovery of material from the site, the kind of recovery that would produce datable artifacts or tool marks analyzable under laboratory conditions, has not been conducted at the scale required to produce definitive conclusions. If the monument is human-made, the construction would predate the historical Ryukyu kingdom by many centuries. The last time the Yonaguni area was above water, based on geological sea level estimates, was approximately 10,000 years ago, at the end of the last ice age. A human-made structure at Yonaguni would therefore be approximately 10,000 years old, making it by far the oldest known architectural structure in the world, predating Göbekli Tepe by 1,000 years, predating every pyramid in Egypt or the Americas. The mainstream archaeological position is that there is no confirmed human-made structure at Yonaguni. But the debate continues, and the monument's ambiguity is itself revealing. The underwater coastal archaeology of East Asia is a field just beginning. The continental shelves surrounding China, Japan, and the Korean peninsula were dry land during the glacial maximum. People lived on them. What they built there is now underwater, and we have barely begun looking. The Yonaguni Monument may be the most visible part of a much larger submerged landscape whose full history has not yet been imagined. Mystery 17. Panini's Chinese counterpart. The Rites of Zhou and Lost Technologies. The Rites of Zhou, Zhouli, is an ancient Chinese text purporting to describe the administrative structure of the early Zhou dynasty. Compiled in a form we can read no earlier than the 2nd century BCE, it describes a government organized into 6 ministries, each subdivided into a vast number of specific official positions with precisely defined duties. Historians have debated for centuries whether the Zhouli describes an actual historical government or is a Confucian ideal of what a properly organized state should look like, projected backward onto the legendary golden age of the early Zhou. What makes the Zhouli relevant to the study of ancient Chinese mysteries is a specific section that describes, in the context of the ministry responsible for public works, a series of technologies for metalworking, woodworking, ceramics, and weaving that are either extraordinarily advanced for their claimed historical period or are descriptions of techniques that we have not been able to fully identify with any known ancient technology. The section on metalworking, for example, describes specific alloy ratios for different types of bronze objects, the proportion of copper to tin varying systematically depending on whether the object being cast is a bell, a weapon, an agricultural tool, or a ritual vessel. The ratios specified in the Zhouli when tested against actual Zhou dynasty bronzes analyzed by modern metallurgists show a remarkable degree of correspondence with the actual alloy compositions found in well-crafted objects of the period. This correspondence implies one of two things. Either the Zhouli accurately records the actual technical practice of Zhou dynasty bronze casting, in which case it is a historical technical document of extraordinary value, or the document was compiled by someone with deep practical knowledge of bronze casting who chose to describe the ideal practice rather than the historical one. Either way, the technical knowledge encoded in the text is real and accurate, and it raises the question of what other technical knowledge the Zhouli encodes that we have not yet fully understood or tested against the physical archaeological record. The broader point that the Zhouli illustrates is one that the entire history of ancient Chinese technology makes clear. The technical knowledge of ancient Chinese civilization was far more sophisticated than the casual observer would expect. It was encoded in texts that appear to be describing idealized administrative structure rather than technical specifications, and the full recovery of that knowledge requires not just reading the text, but testing their technical claims against the physical evidence of what was actually made. Mystery 18. The Ancient Chinese Rocket Tradition and the Fire Arrow Enigma. Chinese military history contains a sequence of technological developments in fire weapons that begins in the Tang dynasty and accelerates through the Song and Ming periods. A sequence that produced, long before any comparable development elsewhere in the world, weapons that were functionally equivalent to modern rockets, grenades, and early firearms. The gunpowder formula, first recorded in a 9th century Chinese alchemical text as a warning about a mixture that caused fires and burned hands, was within 2 centuries being applied to military projectiles of increasing sophistication. The fire arrow, an arrow with a small tube of gunpowder attached, ignited before release to propel it toward the target, appears in Chinese military texts of the 10th century. By the 11th century, the Song dynasty military was deploying fire arrows in organized tactical formations. By the 13th century, in the period of the Mongol conquest, Chinese armies and navies were using fire weapons that went considerably beyond the basic fire arrow, bombs that exploded on contact, poison smoke bombs, early versions of the gun with bronze barrels, and multiple stage rockets designed to deliver incendiary payloads. The mystery here is not that these weapons existed, the historical record is clear. The mystery is the trajectory of development and then partial loss. The knowledge of gunpowder weapons in China was not a steady accumulation from simple to complex. It was episodic. Certain weapons were developed, used extensively, and then either superseded by different developments or simply dropped from the military repertoire without successors. The specific formula for the most effective explosive mixtures shifted between dynasties in ways that suggest the knowledge was not being steadily accumulated and refined, but was being independently rediscovered in different periods by different groups of craftsmen working from different starting points. The specific case of the Song dynasty's iron-cased bomb, a cast iron shell filled with gunpowder, thrown or catapulted toward enemy fortifications, exploding on impact, is a good example. These weapons were used effectively in the defense of Song cities against the Mongol invasion. When the Mongols took over and established the Yuan dynasty, the same weapon-making craftsmen were absorbed into the new military. But the transition disrupted the specific craft lineages and the specific formulations that produced the most effective devices. Yuan dynasty weapons of the same type show degraded performance compared to their Song predecessors. The knowledge had not been fully transferred. The tacit component, the specific practical knowledge held in the hands of the craftsmen who made the best weapons, was partially lost in the conquest. This pattern, achievement, disruption, partial loss, reinvention, runs through the history of Chinese military technology as it runs through Chinese technical history generally. The potential existed for a continuous accumulation that could have produced, by a much earlier date, the kind of systematic military technological development that the European military revolution eventually produced. The disruptions prevented that accumulation. The knowledge was real. The transmission was fragile. Mystery 19. The Zhenghe Map and the Question of What China Knew. In 2006, a Chinese lawyer named Liu Gang announced that he had purchased a map that he claimed was a copy of a 1418 original charted by Zheng He's fleet, a copy made in 1763 from that original. The map, if authentic, would show that Chinese cartographers mapped the entire world, including the Americas, before any European explorer had reached the Western Hemisphere. The map shows North and South America, Australia, Antarctica, and various other landmasses in positions that are roughly consistent with their actual locations, annotated with Chinese text describing the various places and their inhabitants. The Liu Gang map immediately attracted both excited attention and deep scholarly skepticism. The skeptics note that the map shows the Americas in forms consistent with European cartography of the later 16th century rather than with what an independent Chinese explorer in the early 15th century would have been likely to depict. The annotations contain anachronisms, references to knowledge that was not available until after the period the map claims to represent. The cartographic style mixes conventions from different periods and traditions in a way that suggests compilation from multiple later sources rather than original survey. The provenance of the map is unclear. Its history, before Liu Gang purchased it from a Shanghai dealer, is not established. The scholarly consensus is that the Liu Gang map is not an authentic 1418 document. It is most likely a later compilation, possibly of the 18th century, that drew on various sources to create a map showing what a Chinese world exploration might have looked like. It is not evidence that China reached the Americas before Columbus. But the debate around the map points toward a real historical question that the map merely dramatizes in a misleading form. What did China know about the broader world at the height of the Ming dynasty's maritime activity, and how much of that knowledge was lost when Liu Daxia burned the records? The treasure voyages reached East Africa, a continent the Chinese called the land of frankincense, and brought back giraffes and other East African fauna to the imperial court. How detailed was the Chinese cartographic record of the Indian Ocean littoral at this period? How much of that record was among the documents that were burned? We cannot know because the records that would answer these questions are among the ones that were destroyed. The Liu Gang map is a fabrication. The absence it is trying to fill is real. Mystery 20. The 3,000-year script. Continuity without parallel. Chinese writing has been in continuous use for approximately 3,000 years in a form that, while transformed enormously in its specific character shapes, remains structurally related to the oracle bone script of the Shang dynasty. A modern, educated Chinese person given sufficient study time can read texts from the Han dynasty. With more study, they can make sense of oracle bone inscriptions. The specific characters are archaic, but many of them are recognizably ancestral to characters still in use today. The continuity of the writing system across 3 millennia of political, social, and technological transformation is the longest continuous use of a single writing system in the world. No comparable case exists anywhere else in the history of human communication. Every other ancient writing system that survived, Egyptian hieroglyphics, Mesopotamian cuneiform, Greek, was eventually replaced by something else. The Phoenician alphabet gave rise to systems that displaced earlier scripts. The Coptic descendants of Egyptian hieroglyphics were replaced by Arabic. The linear descendants of cuneiform were replaced by alphabetic scripts adopted from neighboring traditions. Chinese writing did not undergo this replacement. It evolved, the character forms changed, the number of characters grew, reforms and standardizations were imposed. But the underlying system, using graphic symbols, each of which represents a morpheme of the spoken language rather than a phoneme of an alphabet, has remained continuous. Why did Chinese writing not alphabetize? Every other writing system that has survived long enough has shown a tendency, over time and under certain historical pressures, to move toward more phonetically transparent representations. Chinese civilization had exposure to alphabetic systems through the Silk Road trade networks, through Buddhist missionaries who brought Indian alphabetic scripts, through the Mongol period during which the Phagspa script was briefly imposed for official use. Chinese scholars understood alphabetic writing. The Bopomofo phonetic notation system, still used in Taiwan to annotate character pronunciation, demonstrates that Chinese can be represented phonetically, but the writing system itself was never replaced. The explanation most commonly offered by linguists is that the phonetic diversity of Chinese, the fact that Mandarin, Cantonese, Min, and the other major Chinese language groups are mutually unintelligible in speech but share the same writing system, made a phonetically based writing system politically impossible. A system encoding the sounds of Mandarin would be unreadable to a Cantonese speaker and would represent the imposition of one dialect on all others. The character-based system, which encodes meaning rather than sound, can be read correctly by speakers of all Chinese varieties, even though they pronounce each character differently. The writing system is, in this analysis, the material embodiment of Chinese political and cultural unity across a linguistically diverse population. The technology that has allowed one civilization to span a geographic and linguistic space that in Europe would have produced dozens of separate nations with separate literary traditions. Whether this unity is the cause of the writing system's survival or a consequence of it is a question that historians of language and political historians have been arguing for generations. What is not arguable is the fact of the continuity itself. 3,000 years of the same system, modified but unbroken. The oracle bone inscriptions legible to those who study them. The Shang dynasty court diviner and the Ming dynasty poet and the modern text message all sharing, at some level, the same fundamental tool of written communication. It is an achievement of cultural continuity that has no parallel in the world, and the specific historical circumstances and decisions that produced and maintained it are still being debated. The Terracotta Army rewards deeper examination of the production logistics that created it. When researchers attempted to calculate the time required to produce 8,000 ceramic warriors at the level of quality the pits contain, they ran into a puzzle. Even with a workforce of thousands of craftsmen working simultaneously, the firing process alone, loading the kilns, maintaining the temperature for the required period, cooling the pieces without cracking them, places constraints on production rate that are difficult to reconcile with the available construction timeline. The reign of Qin Shi Huang lasted from 221 BCE to 210 BCE, 11 years. His tomb project is believed to have begun before his death, likely during the later years of his reign, which suggests the warrior production program ran for perhaps 5 to 8 years at most. 5 to 8 years. 8,000 warriors, plus the horses, the chariots, the bronze weapons, the wooden structures of the pit corridors, the terracotta non-combat figures, and the construction of the pits themselves. The math produces a production rate of approximately 3 to 4 warriors per day, every day, for the entire period. For reference, a single skilled ceramic sculptor today, working with modern tools and without the constraints of maintaining historical authenticity, would struggle to produce one figure of this size and quality per week. The Qin craftsmen were producing multiple per day. The standardized modular production system was not merely a design choice, it was an operational necessity. Without it, the production rate required by the emperor's deadline would have been physically impossible. The organizational structure that made this production rate achievable was itself a remarkable achievement. Researchers analyzing the craftsman's marks, small inscriptions pressed into the clay before firing, identifying the workshop or the individual craftsman responsible for each piece, have identified approximately 85 distinct workshop groups operating simultaneously. Each workshop specialized in a specific component: heads, torsos, arms, legs, hands. Each component was produced to standardized specifications that allowed assembly from parts made by different workshops. The final figures were assembled from components, the joints disguised by careful clay work, and the whole fired as a complete unit. This was true modular production, the functional equivalent of a modern assembly line operating in the 3rd century BCE, turning out the largest ceramic workforce in the history of human civilization. What happened to these workshops after the army was complete? Qin Shi Huang died in 210 BCE. The Qin dynasty collapsed in 206 BCE. In 4 years, everything the first emperor had built was gone. The workshop system that had produced 8,000 warriors was disbanded. The craftsmen who had developed and refined the production system dispersed. The specific organizational knowledge, how to coordinate 85 workshops into a single production process, how to maintain quality control across thousands of simultaneous craftsmen, how to manage the firing of pieces at this scale without catastrophic loss to thermal cracking, went with them into the chaos of the civil war that followed the dynasty's fall. When the Han dynasty eventually stabilized China and began its own building programs, there was no terracotta army. The knowledge of how to produce one was gone. The Sanxingdui bronzes, examined more closely, reveal a sophistication of casting technique that makes their mystery more rather than less profound. Bronze casting at the scale and quality of Sanxingdui requires mastery of several technical processes that, taken individually, are achievable with the technology of the period, but that together, at this scale and this quality, push against the limits of what the technology should have been capable of achieving. The largest of the Sanxingdui standing trees, the sacred bronze trees that were found in the pits alongside the masks and the standing figure, measure over 3 meters tall. These are not solid bronze objects, they are hollow castings, their branches and leaves thin-walled and delicate, assembled from separately cast components that were then joined. The joining technique used at Sanxingdui, a process of casting new bronze around an existing piece to fuse them together, creating a seamless joint, requires precise control of temperature, of the composition of the joining bronze, and of the heat distribution during the pour. A joint that is too hot destroys the existing piece. A joint that is too cold fails to fuse. The temperature window for a successful join is narrow, and achieving it consistently across the complex multi-component assembly of a 3-meter bronze tree requires a level of technical control that implies years of accumulated craft experience in the specific technique. The elephant tusks found in the pits provide a separate thread of evidence about the geographic reach of the Sanxingdui civilization. Elephants were present in the Sichuan Basin in the Bronze Age period. The climate of that era was warmer and wetter than today, and the subtropical zone in which elephants are found extended further north. The tusks in the pits were not necessarily imported from distant sources, but the cowrie shells, the small seashells used as currency and ritual objects throughout Bronze Age China, are a different matter. Cowrie shells come from the tropical Indian and Pacific Oceans. Their presence in a Bronze Age site in Sichuan province, which is one of the most landlocked regions of China, proves that the Sanxingdui civilization was connected to trade networks reaching the coast, a distance of hundreds of miles across terrain that was not easily traversed. The trade connections that the cowrie shells prove, combined with the objects at Sanxingdui that show contact with Shang bronze-making traditions, place Sanxingdui in a web of Bronze Age exchange that extended across much of what is now China. This civilization was not isolated, it was trading, it knew about the Shang, it had access to coastal goods, and yet it produced art of a kind that no other Bronze Age culture in the region produced, worshipped entities that no other Bronze Age culture in the region worshipped, and then destroyed its most sacred objects and buried them in pits in a way that no other Bronze Age culture in the region documented. The mystery of Sangqingdui is not the mystery of an isolated culture that developed independently of everything around it. It is the mystery of a culture that was deeply connected to the broader Bronze Age world of China, and yet was doing something that none of its neighbors were doing, something whose specific logic and meaning are still sealed in the undeciphered script on the few inscribed objects the pits have yielded. The underwater city of Xicheng sits at a depth that is challenging but not impossible for recreational diving, 26 to 40 meters, within the range of advanced sport divers using standard equipment. This accessibility has made the Lion City one of China's most discussed dive sites and has attracted international media attention since the organized dive expeditions of the early 2000s began producing photographs that circulated widely on the internet. The photographs are genuinely extraordinary. Wide-angle shots of stone archways covered in the delicate soft corals and fish that have colonized the underwater surfaces over 60 years of inundation, the carvings of dragons and fish visible beneath the marine growth, the stone lions in their original positions as if awaiting visitors who will descend rather than walk in through the gate. But the accessibility that makes Xicheng photogenic also creates problems for its long-term preservation. Every dive stirs up silt that settles on the carved surfaces. Every diver who touches a carving, and the temptation to reach out and touch a dragon carved in the 13th century is understandable, contributes microscopically to the abrasion of a surface that the cold water had been protecting. The Chinese government's caution about opening Xicheng to unrestricted diving is not bureaucratic obstruction. It is a genuine protective instinct about a site whose preservation has been entrusted to the water above it and whose vulnerability to careless human interaction has been demonstrated at comparable underwater sites around the world. The deliberate choice to flood Xicheng in 1959 without removing the architecture is itself a historical document of a particular kind of decision-making. The government in 1959 was focused on the hydroelectric infrastructure that the dam would provide. The cultural heritage value of the architecture was not the primary consideration in a period when China was in the middle of a rapid industrialization program that prioritized economic development over historical preservation. The decision was made, the water rose, and the unintended consequence of that decision, the accidental preservation of a 1400-year-old town in conditions that have protected it better than the surface ever would have, is one of the stranger ironies in the history of Chinese heritage. The town that is waiting at the bottom of Qiandao Lake is not just an archaeological site, it is a record of provincial Chinese life across 14 centuries, across the Tang and Song and Yuan and Ming and Qing dynasties, through the imperial examinations and the local magistracies and the guild halls and the temple complexes of a functioning provincial town. The architecture that survived the inundation is the framework of that life. What happened inside the buildings, the businesses conducted, the ceremonies performed, the disputes adjudicated, the ordinary and extraordinary events of 1400 years of habitation in a single place, is recorded in documents that did not survive the water. But the buildings are still there, and the buildings are the architecture of everything that happened inside them, and the archaeology of what they contained and how they were arranged is still mostly unread. The Longyu Caves present one additional layer of mystery that the initial discovery accounts do not fully convey. When researchers descended into the caves after the water was pumped out and examined the fish scale pattern on the walls more carefully, they discovered that the pattern was not simply a surface decoration applied after the main carving was complete. The fish scale marks are cut directly into the load-bearing stone of the walls and columns as part of the primary carving process. This means that the workers who carved the caves were simultaneously doing two things: removing stone to create the space and applying the precise decorative pattern to the surfaces they were revealing. The decorative intent and the structural intent were unified from the beginning. The surface the stoneworkers were creating was already the finished surface. They were not roughing out a cavern and then finishing it later. They were finishing it as they went. This unified process has a significant implication for understanding the workforce that created the Longyou caves. A worker who can simultaneously manage the structural requirements of carving a load-bearing wall and the aesthetic requirements of applying a consistent 45-degree fish scale pattern to the surface being created is a highly skilled worker with a well-internalized technique. Not a laborer following simple instructions, but a craftsman with a thorough understanding of both the structural and the aesthetic goals of the project. Multiplying this level of skill across the workforce required to create 36 caverns of this size produces an estimate of the number of skilled craftsmen involved that is very large by any standard. And a project employing a very large number of highly skilled craftsmen for an extended period, probably years, would have been a significant economic event in the region, generating trade, requiring supply chains for food and tools and lamp oil, attracting attention from the administrative authorities responsible for tracking economic activity in the area. The silence of the historical record about the Longyou caves becomes, the more you examine it, more rather than less puzzling. Not only is there no record of the project, there is no economic shadow of the project in the surrounding records, no spike in tool production, no requisition of labor, no local chronicle noting the unusual activity of a large workforce appearing in the area and then disappearing. The caves were created by people who were economically and administratively invisible. The most parsimonious explanation is that the records that documented them are among the records that did not survive the 2,000 years between their creation and their rediscovery. But the absence is so total across so many categories of potential documentation that even the most committed advocate of the perishable records explanation is left with a residual unease. The oracle bones give us, beyond the mystery of the script's sudden appearance, an intimate portrait of Shang religious life that is unmatched in any other surviving source. The Shang believed in a complex pantheon of ancestor spirits and divine forces, and the divination system recorded on the bones was the primary mechanism through which the royal court communicated with and influenced these forces. The king was not merely a political ruler. He was the primary religious specialist, the person through whom the divine world communicated with the human world and through whom human requests were transmitted to the divine world. The oracle bone divination was a royal prerogative, and the inscriptions are predominantly royal divination. The specific fears and preoccupations that the oracle bones record give us a Shang court that is recognizably human in its anxieties. The king asks the bones whether he should send an army to a specific territory, and the bones answer. He asks whether the harvest will be good, and the bones answer. He asks whether a specific illness that has struck a member of the royal family is the work of a specific ancestral spirit, and the bones answer. He asks in inscriptions that researchers find both poignant and mundane whether it will rain, whether the hunt will succeed, whether a specific dream is auspicious. The divination answers, recorded on the bones along with the questions, are phrased in terms of auspicious or inauspicious, favorable or unfavorable. But some of the oracle bone inscriptions also include a final notation, the verification. After the question and the answer is recorded, a later hand sometimes added a note recording what actually happened. Did it rain? Did the army succeed? Did the illness resolve? These verification notations are the closest thing the oracle bones produce to experimental data, a record of how well the divination system actually predicted outcomes. The answer from the verification notations is that the system performed approximately at the level of chance. The bones were not reliable predictors of future events. This conclusion would not have surprised the Shang court diviners, who presumably understood from experience that divination was not primarily a predictive system but a communicative one, a way of establishing a conversation with the ancestor spirits rather than a method of forecasting the weather. The transition from the Shang to the Zhou dynasty in 1046 BCE brought with it a significant shift in how the divine world was conceptualized. The Zhou introduced or formalized the concept of the mandate of heaven, Tianming, which shifted the divine authority for rulership from the ancestor spirits of the ruling family to a more abstract universal principle. The oracle bone divination system did not survive the transition in its original form. The Zhou court continued to use divination, but through different methods. The milfoil stalks and their hexagrams that became the I Ching, rather than the fire-cracked bones of the Shang. The oracle bone archive at Anyang was the last of its kind, the record of a divination tradition that was superseded and eventually forgotten until the pharmacy dragon bones of the 1890s brought it back into the light. The Tarim Basin mummies have generated intense interest from researchers outside the conventional boundaries of Chinese and Central Asian archaeology because they sit at the intersection of several major questions in the study of early human population history. The ancient North Eurasian ancestry identified in the 2021 genetic study is a population that appears as a significant contributor to many different later Eurasian gene pools, to the populations of the steppe, to the indigenous peoples of the Americas, to the populations of South Asia. But that has left no strong direct descendants in any modern population. It is a ghost population, something whose presence can be inferred from the genetic patterns of others, but that has not survived into the present as a discrete group. The Tarim Basin mummies appear to be the most direct descendants of this ancient North Eurasian population that have yet been identified in the archaeological record. They seem to represent a population that remained in or near the Tarim Basin region, sheltered from the genetic mixing that was occurring on the surrounding steppes and plains by the geographical isolation of the basin's desert environment, while the ancient North Eurasians elsewhere were absorbing and being absorbed by other populations. The Tarim Basin was, in this analysis, a refuge population, the last remnant of an ancient Eurasian people that had once been widespread. This framing transforms the visual strangeness of the mummies, the light hair, the un-East Asian faces, the tall bodies, from a puzzle about cultural contact into a puzzle about deep population history. These are not Europeans who somehow got to China. They are a population that was in the region before either Europe or China developed the population identities we associate with those places today. They are the people who were there first, or at least they are the most direct surviving descendants of the people who were there first. Their eventual disappearance from the genetic record, their absorption into the surrounding populations as the Tarim Basin opened to greater contact with the Silk Road, is not a mystery. It is the expected consequence of the ending of their isolation. What is mysterious, and what the 2021 study has made more, rather than less mysterious, is where they came from in the first place and how they maintained their isolation for so long. Zhang Heng, the inventor of the seismoscope, deserves more than a footnote in the history of Chinese science. He was perhaps the most comprehensively accomplished intellectual of the Han dynasty, a period that itself produced extraordinary scholarly achievement. In addition to the seismoscope, he is credited with significant improvements to the armillary sphere, the astronomical instrument used for tracking the positions of celestial bodies, and with theoretical contributions to the understanding of the nature of the moon and its relationship to the sun. He proposed that the moon shines with reflected sunlight rather than its own light, a conclusion that required careful observation and reasoning from the phases of the moon and its behavior during lunar eclipses. This conclusion, which would have been intellectually radical in the Chinese astronomical context of the 2nd century CE, appears in his surviving writings without particular elaboration, as if it were an established fact rather than a revolutionary proposal. He was also a poet and a literary figure of significance. His two major prose poems, the Sijingfu and the Dongjingfu, are lengthy, elaborate compositions in the Fu genre, describing the two Han capitals of Chang'an and Luoyang in exhaustive and magnificent detail. These works preserve, in poetic form, a picture of Han dynasty urban life that would otherwise be inaccessible from the fragmentary administrative and archaeological record. Zhang Heng, walking through the markets of Luoyang and recording what he saw, the merchants, the entertainers, the foods, the sounds, was doing something that no one else was systematically doing in the 2nd century CE, creating a contemporary record of a city as it was actually lived in. The loss of Zhang Heng's seismoscope knowledge is therefore the loss of one component of a much larger intellectual project, the project of systematically understanding the natural world through observation and instrument-making, which Zhang Heng was pursuing with a breadth and a rigor that has few parallels in the ancient world anywhere. His seismoscope was not an isolated invention. It was the product of the same observational and mechanical intelligence that produced his astronomical instruments and his theoretical astronomy. When the knowledge of how to build the seismoscope was lost, what was lost was a specific application of a general intelligence. And that intelligence, embodied in Zhang Heng himself, had died in 139 CE and had not been replaced by anyone of comparable scope and ambition in the specific domains he had worked in. Zheng He's tomb in Nanjing is a cenotaph, a memorial to a man buried elsewhere, who died at sea on the return from the seventh voyage and was interred in the Indian Ocean rather than on Chinese soil. The tomb was destroyed during the Taiping Rebellion in the 19th century and has been partially restored. It is a quiet place, a hillside in the southern suburbs of Nanjing, with cypress trees and carved stone animals lining the approach, the standard apparatus of Chinese imperial tomb memorial applied to a man who was not buried there and who never held an imperial rank. Zheng He is honored in Malaysia, in Indonesia, in the countries of the Indian Ocean littoral, where the memory of the treasure fleets persists in local traditions, and where Chinese communities, founded partly through the maritime connections of the early Ming period, still carry the cultural inheritance of those voyages. In the port city of Malacca, one of the major stops on the treasure fleet routes, there is a shrine to Zheng He that has been maintained continuously since the 15th century. The local tradition holds that Zheng He left behind representatives and advisors who integrated into Malaccan society and married local women, creating the community of Peranakan Chinese Malays who maintain elements of both Chinese and Malay culture and who are still a distinct community in Malaysia today. Whether this specific tradition is historically accurate in all its details is debated, but the cultural memory of the treasure fleet visits is real and has been maintained over 6 centuries. In China itself, the memory of Zheng He faded for centuries after the cancellation of the voyages and has been actively recovered only in the recent decades, during which China has found it politically useful to remember that it once had the world's greatest fleet, a memory that supports contemporary narratives about Chinese maritime tradition and China's historical role in the Indian Ocean region. The recovery of this memory is selective, as all historical memory is. Zheng He as a symbol of Chinese maritime outreach is emphasized. Zheng He as a eunuch who rose to power through a palace political faction that was eventually suppressed by the Confucian scholar official class is not. The history is complicated and the memorialization simplifies it. What is not simplified and cannot be is the physical evidence, the stone tablet in Colombo, the Chinese porcelain in East African soil, the architectural heritage of the Peranakan Chinese communities across Southeast Asia. The fleet was real, the voyages were real, the records that would have told us exactly what was seen and learned and mapped and understood during those 7 voyages are gone, and the world that would have developed from continued Chinese maritime engagement is the world that did not happen. The 9 songs of the Chuzi, the ancient Chinese poetic collection attributed to Qu Yuan, contain within them the record of a shamanic religious tradition whose specific content has been lost, but whose emotional texture has survived in the poems themselves. The Lord of the East, the Lady of the Xiang River, the Mountain Spirit, the Lord of the Clouds. These are the deities addressed in the 9 songs, and the poems are hymns of invocation and encounter, describing what it feels like to be in the presence of these specific divine beings in a specific ritual context. The shamanic tradition the 9 songs preserve was not unique to Chu. Related practices appear in the archaeological and textual record of many early Chinese states, and elements of it persisted in various forms in Chinese popular religious practice for centuries after the Confucian mainstream displaced it from elite culture. But the specific Chu version, the specific deities, the specific emotional texture of the divine encounter as the poems describe it, the specific ritual context in which the encounter occurred, is largely accessible only through the 9 songs themselves. They are the primary source for a tradition that they were already beginning to historicize and memorialize rather than actively practice at the time they were written down. What is most striking about the 9 songs read as religious documents rather than literary ones is the intimacy they describe. The divine beings they address are not remote and transcendent. They are present, physically, sensually present in the ritual space. The Lord of the East smells of a specific fragrance. The Lady of the Hesiang River makes a specific sound as she moves through the water. The mountain spirit is beautiful in a specific way, and the poet describes being affected by that beauty. The encounter is not between a human being and an overwhelming divine power. It is between a human being and a divine being who has consented to be present, who has been invited through the ritual, and has arrived, who is temporarily sharing the ritual space with the human participants. This intimacy, this sense of the divine as present and approachable rather than remote and overpowering, is very different from the theology of later Chinese religious traditions. It is possibly very old, older than the Chu state that preserved it in poetic form, a remnant of a relationship between humans and the divine that existed before the philosophical systematization of the Han Dynasty changed the terms of the conversation. The continuity of Chinese writing across 3,000 years points toward a broader question about the nature of Chinese civilization and what has made it so remarkably durable. Every other civilization of comparable age has undergone discontinuity, has had its language replaced, its religion transformed beyond recognition, its fundamental cultural framework disrupted by conquest or internal collapse. Chinese civilization has undergone all of these pressures. Conquest by the Mongols, conquest by the Manchu, internal collapse of the Han and Tang and Song dynasties, radical political transformation in the 20th century, and has maintained continuities of language, of writing, of cultural practice, and of institutional structure across all of them that have no parallel in the history of any other civilization. The Mongol conquest of China in the 13th century is a useful example. The Mongol Yuan dynasty that ruled China from 1271 to 1368 represents the most total military conquest of the Chinese state ever achieved by an outside power. The Mongol rulers did not speak Chinese, they did not write Chinese, they maintained a distinct Mongol cultural identity throughout their rule and were deeply suspicious of the Han Chinese scholar official class that had administered the Chinese state through previous dynasties. They abolished the examination system that had selected officials based on mastery of the Confucian classics, the system that was the backbone of Chinese administrative continuity, and replaced it with different mechanisms for selecting administrators. By almost every standard measure of civilizational continuity, the Mongol conquest should have been a decisive break. It was not. The Han Chinese scholar official class maintained the written traditions in private. The Confucian classics continued to be copied and transmitted. The literary tradition continued, largely underground, in the private academies and the temple schools that the Mongol administration did not reach deeply enough to suppress. When the Ming dynasty expelled the Mongols and restored Han Chinese rule in 1368, the administrative apparatus of the Chinese state was reconstituted from the traditions that had been maintained in private through the Mongol period. The Mongol century left marks, certain administrative practices, certain artistic influences, certain vocabulary, but did not break the essential continuity of Chinese civilization. The writing system was the mechanism that made this impossible to break. As long as the texts were being copied and the characters were being written, the tradition was being maintained. This is what 3,000 years of continuous writing means. Not just aesthetic continuity, not just institutional continuity, but the specific kind of civilizational resilience that comes from a tradition of knowledge transmission that cannot be destroyed by political conquest because it lives in the hands and the memories of people who carry it privately in the schools and the homes and the monasteries of a civilization that knows its own tradition well enough to sustain it without state support. The oracle bones are the beginning of this tradition. The texts being written in Mandarin today are its continuation, and the specific decisions about what the writing system would be, about how it would be taught, about what texts were worth preserving, that have been made and remade across 3,000 years of Chinese history, are the choices that produced one of the most extraordinary demonstrations of civilizational continuity the world has ever seen. Tonight we have traveled across 5,000 years of Chinese history and through 20 mysteries that history has produced and not yet resolved. We stood in the pits of the terracotta army and looked at weapons that should have corroded and did not, at faces suggesting a diversity of origin that the standard account does not fully explain, and at a burial mound sealed for 22 centuries above Mercury rivers that sensors confirm but no excavator has yet seen. We looked at the bronze masks of Sanxingdui and confronted a civilization that the mainstream record of Chinese history did not acknowledge, whose gods have eyes that project from their faces like windows to another world, whose sacred objects were deliberately destroyed and buried in a moment of crisis that left no explanation. We descended into the cold, clear water of Qiandao Lake and found a town of stone archways and carved lions that was inhabited for 1,400 years and submerged in 1959 and is still there, perfectly preserved, its buildings sealed, its contents unknown. We pumped out farmers' ponds in Zhejiang and found 36 enormous caverns carved with extraordinary precision by hands that left no record in the most record-keeping civilization in human history. We read the oldest star map in the world, sealed in a desert cave for 900 years. We watched a writing system appear fully formed in the archaeological record without the developmental stages that every other writing system has left behind. We found the faces of a genetically isolated people in the Tarim Basin Desert, wearing tartan clothing 3,000 years ago, belonging to a population whose origin story is still being assembled from ancient DNA. We watched Ma Jun demonstrate a differential gear in 220 CE and watched the knowledge of how to build it disappear after his death. We looked at 12 creatures on a silk scroll that no researcher has been able to identify, belonging to a mythology sealed in a tomb. We followed Zheng He's fleet into the Indian Ocean and watched it stop, the records burned, the ships left to rot. Each of these mysteries is a point where the physical record and the historical record either conflict or fall silent, or show something that the conventional timeline says should not be there. The weapons that should have corroded, the civilization that the record did not acknowledge, the caverns that the record does not mention, the writing system with no visible beginning, the earthquake detector with no visible successor, the fleet that turned back, the cauldrons that represented the right to rule China and that vanished without a trace. China has been keeping its secrets for a very long time. The earth of Shanxi is keeping the first emperor's burial chamber sealed, and the Mercury rivers still unchanged since 210 BCE. The cold water of Qiandao Lake is keeping the stone streets of Xicheng preserved in the dark below the waterline. The silt of the Sea River is keeping perhaps the 9 cauldrons. The rock of the cliff at Mogao may be keeping another sealed room, another 40,000 manuscripts, another star atlas from a tradition we have not yet learned to name. The investigations will continue. The archaeology of China is one of the most active fields in the world, funded by a government that understands the value of its deep history and by an international community of scholars who understand the intellectual value of what remains in the ground. Every year produces new excavations, new analyses of previously recovered material with new techniques, new satellite surveys of landscapes not previously examined on the ground. The Terracotta Army has been in excavation since 1974 and has produced surprises in every decade since. The Sanxingdui site has been excavated intermittently since 1986, and its 2021 campaign produced a sealed bronze box, whose contents are still being analyzed. The Dunhuang manuscripts are still being translated and published, discoveries still emerging from the 40,000 documents sealed in that cave in approximately 1000 CE. The earth of China is patient. It has been holding these things for a very long time, and it will hold them until we are ready to understand them. The bronzes are in their cases in Guanggan, the projecting eyes looking outward at the visitors who come to look at them? Somewhere in the Shanxi plain, sealed beneath its mound for 22 centuries, an emperor's burial chamber holds its contents in the dark. The mercury still, the ceiling of pearls and constellations still, whatever Qin Shi Huang arranged in that chamber in 210 BCE, still there, unchanged, waiting for the technology that will allow us to open it without destroying what's inside. We are still here, 2,200 years later, trying to figure out how to open it. That patience, ours and the Earth's, is perhaps the most characteristic thing about this entire investigation. The questions are old. The answers are still forming. And tonight, in the quiet, all of it is waiting. All. There is one more dimension of the Sanxingdui mystery that deserves fuller treatment before we close tonight. The 2021 excavations, which opened 6 new pits and produced an extraordinary quantity of new material, also produced something that the 1986 excavations had not: evidence of a geographical connection between Sanxingdui and other Bronze Age sites across a wider region of China. Specific types of jade objects found in the new Sanxingdui pits, rectangular Kong tubes, circular B discs, are identical in form to jade objects associated with the Liangzhu culture that had flourished in the Yangtze River Delta region roughly 1,000 years before the Sanxingdui pits were created and roughly 1,500 miles away. How jade objects in the specific stylistic tradition of a culture that had collapsed 1,000 years earlier ended up in ritual pits in Sichuan is a question that adds another layer to an already layered mystery. The Liangzhu culture, which occupied what is now Zhejiang and Jiangsu provinces from approximately 3,300 BCE to 2,300 BCE, is itself one of the most remarkable Neolithic cultures in the world. It built extensive hydraulic engineering works, dams, canals, reservoirs, on a scale that researchers have described as a hydraulic society comparable in its organizational sophistication to the early civilizations of Mesopotamia. It produced jade artifacts of extraordinary quality, the Kong and Bai forms among them, that appear to have carried deep religious significance. The Kong tube's square exterior and round interior has been interpreted as representing the relationship between earth and heaven, and the Bai disc as a symbol of the sky. The Liangzhu culture collapsed around 2300 BCE, apparently in connection with catastrophic flooding events that may have submerged many of its hydraulic works. Its specific religious and material traditions were dispersed, carried by the populations that migrated as the culture collapsed. 1,000 years later, specific jade forms from the Liangzhu tradition appear in the ritual pits of Sanxingdui, in a culture separated from Liangzhu by both time and geography. The most straightforward explanation is that the Kong and Bi forms had, over the intervening millennium, diffused across the Bronze Age cultures of China to become widely shared religious symbols whose specific Liangzhu origin was no longer remembered or relevant. Shared religious forms that different cultures used in their own ways for their own purposes. This explanation is reasonable. What it implies, however, is a degree of Bronze Age cultural interconnection across the Chinese subcontinent that the traditional narrative of isolated regional cultures developing independently does not fully capture. The Bronze Age world of China was more connected, more aware of what other cultures were doing, more willing to adopt and adapt the religious forms of distant traditions than the map of discrete cultural zones that archaeologists drew before the Sanxingdui pits were opened. The Dunhuang manuscripts as a collection contain, beyond the Star Atlas, several other items that are worth mentioning as indicators of the breadth of what that sealed cave library held. Among the 40,000 manuscripts are the oldest printed texts ever found, printed using woodblock printing, a technology that China developed centuries before Gutenberg's movable type reached Europe. The Diamond Sutra, a Buddhist text printed in 868 CE and found in the Dunhuang cave, is the oldest complete dated printed book in the world. It was not a rough early attempt at printing. It is a sophisticated, well-organized document printed with clear, even blocks from carefully prepared wood blocks. This is not the beginning of printing. This is a mature technology applied with confidence to the production of a religious text for distribution. The fact that the oldest surviving printed book in the world was found sealed in a cave in the Gansu Desert, preserved by accident rather than by institutional intention, tells you something important about the fragility of the record of Chinese technological achievement. The woodblock printing tradition was alive and active throughout the Tang and Song dynasties, producing Buddhist texts, government documents, calendars, and eventually the first printed books in the modern sense. Almost all of the output of this printing tradition from the Tang period has not survived. The materials, paper and ink, are organic and fragile. The printed texts were used and wore out and were not systematically preserved. What survived in the Dunhuang cave survived because someone sealed a room, and the dry desert air did the rest. The technology that produced the printed books that filled Chinese libraries through the Tang and Song periods was real and active and sophisticated. The evidence of it outside the Dunhuang manuscripts is largely gone. This pattern, technology achieved, widely applied, and then surviving in the archaeological record only by accident, is not unique to printing. It is the general condition of the Chinese technological record. What we know is what survived. What survived is a fraction of what existed. And the fraction that survived was not selected by any intentional preservation logic. It was selected by the accidents of who sealed what, where, and what happened to the sealed thing over the subsequent centuries. The Dunhuang cave sealed its 40,000 manuscripts and the dry air kept them. The imperial court burned Zhenghe's records and they are gone. The craft workshops of the Qin bronzesmiths were disbanded when the dynasty fell, and the specific knowledge of the chromium surface treatment went with them. The earthquake detector worked for 7 years, and then its builder died, and no one knew how to replicate it. We are reading the record of Chinese civilization from what the accidents of history left us. The full record was much larger, much richer, and much stranger than what we have. The glimpses we get of that fuller record, in the oracle bones, in the Dunhuang manuscripts, in the bronze masks of Sanxingdui, in the fish-scale walls of the Longyu caves, are extraordinary enough to suggest that the full record, if we had it, would require us to substantially revise our understanding of what was known and achieved in the ancient world. We do not have the full record, we have the fragments, and the fragments are extraordinary. The patient work of reading those fragments continues every day in laboratories and archives and excavation sites across China and around the world. The Oracle Bone Decipherment Project adds newly identified characters to the decoded corpus every few years as researchers find patterns that previous analysts missed. The Sanxingdui excavations continue, the new pits yielding new objects, and the new objects generating new interpretive frameworks for everything that came before. The genetic analysis of ancient populations in Xinjiang and the surrounding regions continues, each new genome adding a data point to the map of prehistoric human movement that the Tarim mummy research is helping to construct. The underwater archaeology of Xicheng continues, constrained by resources and conditions but advancing, the stone archways slowly being mapped and the stone lions being measured and documented in a way that will eventually produce a complete plan of the submerged town. The work that will eventually resolve the mystery of the Longyu caves, if it is resolved, will probably not come from excavation, but from analysis. The fish-scale pattern on the cavern walls is a consistent signature, and consistent signatures are susceptible to comparison across the Chinese archaeological record. If a similar pattern appears anywhere else, in a tool, in a text, in any other archaeological context, it provides a handle. The absence of the pattern from the known archaeological record is part of what makes the caves so puzzling. But the known archaeological record is, as we have established tonight, less than 1% of the actual record. The fish-scale pattern may appear in records that have not yet been excavated, or in records that have been excavated and not yet fully analyzed, or in texts that have been translated but not yet cross-referenced against the physical evidence of the caves. The connection, if it exists, is waiting to be found, and the tomb of Qin Shi Huang is waiting for the technology that will allow it to be opened safely. The technology does not yet exist at the standard required. It will exist. The trajectory of materials science and archaeological technology points clearly in that direction, and the specific problem of preserving organic and pigment materials in the moments of first air exposure after long burial, is being actively researched. When the technology is ready and the decision is made to open the chamber, what is found inside will be the single most significant archaeological discovery in human history. An emperor's vision of his empire in miniature, built from the materials of 2,000 years of Chinese craft tradition, sealed in 210 BCE and untouched since. The Mercury rivers, the Pearl constellations, whatever else Qin Shi Huang arranged for his eternity. It is there, in the dark beneath the Shanxi plain, patient as the emperor who built it, waiting for the morning when we are ready to see it. Sleep well tonight, knowing that somewhere in the Shanxi plain, sealed beneath its mound for 22 centuries, an emperor's burial chamber holds its contents unchanged since 210 BCE. The Mercury is still. The ceiling of pearls and constellations is still. The bronze mechanisms that once moved the Mercury rivers have not moved in 2,000 years. Whatever Qin Shi Huang arranged in that chamber in the months and years before his death, whatever vision of his empire in miniature he wanted to carry into whatever came after, is still there, waiting. And we are still here, 22 centuries later, trying to figure out how to open it without destroying what's inside. That patience, ours and the Earth's, is perhaps the most characteristic thing about this entire investigation. The questions are old, the answers are still forming. The bronze masks look outward with their projecting eyes. The fish-scale walls wait in the dark below the empty ponds of Zhejiang. The Star Atlas holds its 1,350 plotted stars in the manuscript collection of the British Library. The oracle bones spell out the anxieties of a 3,000-year-old king in a script that is 1/3 understood and 2/3 still waiting for the researcher who will find the key. China is the oldest continuous civilization in the world, and it keeps its secrets in the oldest possible way, in the earth, in the dark, sealed and waiting. Tonight, across the Shanxi Plain and the Sichuan Basin and the Gansu Desert and the cold water of Zhejiang's reservoir lake, the keeping goes on. And we are getting closer. One excavation and one genome and one deciphered character at a time to the full picture of what was known and made and achieved in this ancient place. The picture, when it is fully visible, will be extraordinary. The fragments we already have suggest nothing less. Tonight, in the quiet, that is enough to carry you gently into sleep. The bronze casting tradition of ancient China deserves a closer examination than the Sanqingdui section alone provides, because the puzzle of Chinese Bronze Age metallurgy runs deeper than a single unusual site. The Shang dynasty bronzes of the Yellow River Valley, the ritual vessels, the wine containers, the axes and helmets and bells that have been recovered in extraordinary quantities from Shang period burials and ritual deposits, represent a tradition of bronze casting that arrived in China fully developed. This is the same puzzle that we noted with the oracle bone script, no convincing developmental sequence. Copper and bronze working appears in the Chinese archaeological record in a relatively sophisticated form very early in its history. The early Bronze Age cultures of the northern Chinese steppes, which predate the Shang dynasty, produced bronze weapons and ornaments that show competence with the basic technology. But the specific type of bronze casting associated with the Shang, the production of large, complex, thin-walled vessels with elaborate surface decoration using piece mold casting rather than the lost wax method, does not have a clear developmental precursor in the Chinese record. The piece mold casting technique used by the Shang bronzesmiths is technically different from the lost wax casting used in Mesopotamia and the Mediterranean world, and this technical difference has been used as evidence that Chinese bronze casting developed independently rather than being transmitted from the West. But independent development still requires a developmental sequence, and the developmental sequence for piece mold casting of the Shang type has not been convincingly identified. The piece mold technique works by creating a model of the intended vessel, pressing clay into the model to take an impression of the surface detail, cutting the clay impression into multiple pieces that can be removed from the model without distortion, firing the clay pieces to create rigid molds, assembling the molds around a core, and pouring molten bronze into the space between the molds and the core. The resulting vessel, when the molds are removed, carries the surface detail of the original model transferred through the clay impression to the bronze surface. The technique allows the production of thin-walled vessels with complex surface decoration, but it requires precise calculation of the shrinkage of both the clay molds and the bronze as they cool, and precise management of the pour to fill the mold completely before the bronze solidifies. These are problems that require empirical solutions accumulated through trial and error across many generations of craftsmen. Where those generations of trial and error occurred in the Chinese case is not clear from the archaeological record. The craft tradition that eventually produced the great Shang ritual bronzes, the four-legged Fang Ding cauldrons, the wine containers covered in the Taote mask motif, the bells calibrated to produce specific musical pitches, developed somewhere over some period, producing the knowledge that the Shang bronzesmiths applied. The physical evidence of that development has either not been found or did not survive in a form that is recognizable. What we have is the fully developed tradition, producing objects of extraordinary quality from its first appearance in the record, and the developmental history that produced that tradition is as opaque as the developmental history of the oracle bone script. The Taote motif itself, the symmetrical mask-like face that decorates the surfaces of so many Shang bronzes, its features including two large eyes, a nose, sometimes horns or animal ears, but typically no lower jaw, is a design of specific and consistent character that researchers have been debating for decades without reaching consensus about what it represents. Is it a specific supernatural being, a deity, a guardian, a monster? Is it an abstract design that evolved from animal representations through a process of stylization until the original animal was no longer recognizable? Is it multiple different animal motifs that happen to share a common grammar of large eyes and bilateral symmetry? Is it, as some researchers have proposed, a representation of the human face of the person consuming the ritual food or drink in the vessel, a kind of self-referential image of the user built into the object? None of these interpretations has been definitively established, and the Taote continues to stare out from thousands of museum bronzes with its eyeless stare, holding its meaning in the specific visual logic of a symbolic system that predates any surviving text that might explain it. The Great Wall's history as a physical object is considerably messier and more interesting than the clean, linear narrative of the popular account suggests. The wall that tourists visit north of Beijing was built by the Ming dynasty, primarily during the 15th and 16th centuries, using materials that included fired brick, a more durable and more expensive construction material than the rammed earth and stone used in earlier sections. The Ming Wall was built in response to specific strategic circumstances. The Mongol threat had not disappeared after the Yuan dynasty was expelled, and the early Ming period saw repeated Mongol incursions across the northern frontier. The decision to build a wall of this quality and permanence reflected a strategic assessment that the nomadic threat would be persistent and that a substantial defensive investment was justified. Earlier walls, the walls of the Qin and Han dynasties, were built from different materials in different strategic contexts. The Qin Wall, commissioned by the first emperor as part of his program of unifying the northern frontier, was built from rammed earth reinforced with local stone where available, following the natural terrain of the northern ranges rather than imposing a straight line on the landscape. The workers who built it, conscripted laborers, convicts, soldiers, worked in conditions that later accounts describe as horrific. The specific death toll of the Qin Wall construction has never been established, but the wall's construction became one of the standard examples of tyrannical overreach cited by critics of the first emperor, suggesting that the human cost was widely known and widely resented. The Han extension of the wall westward into the Gansu corridor, the narrow passage between the Kilian Mountains and the Gobi Desert that connects the Yellow River Valley to the Tarim Basin and the Silk Road, created the physical infrastructure that allowed the Han dynasty to project power into Central Asia and to protect the trade routes that carried the goods of the Silk Road. The Dunhuang that held the Star Atlas was at the western end of this Han Wall extension. The watchtowers that lined the wall at regular intervals were not just defensive positions, they were the communication infrastructure of the frontier, passing signals by fire and smoke that could convey standard military messages across hundreds of miles in a matter of hours. The wall sections in Mongolia that we discussed earlier sit in relationship to this Han infrastructure in a way that is still being worked out. The Han Wall along the Gansu corridor is relatively well documented. The additional wall structures north of the main Han line, the ones that do not fit the known Han construction programs, are the ones that remain puzzling. They were built by someone for some purpose using some organizational capability. The landscape of northern China and southern Mongolia holds these structures in the soil and the grass, and the satellite imagery reveals them as shadows on the land, waiting for the ground surveys and the excavations that will eventually establish who built them and why. The flood myth that Fuxi and Nuwa survived connects to a specific geographical event in Chinese legendary history that may preserve a real geological memory. The myth of the Great Yu, the legendary emperor who tamed the Great Flood and whose 9 bronze cauldrons we discussed earlier, describes a flooding event that covered the earth and that required 10 years of hydraulic engineering to control. Yu is said to have dredged channels, raised embankments, and redirected the flow of rivers across the entire Chinese landscape to bring the waters under control. The specific hydraulic interventions described in the Yu mythology correspond, in their general geography, to the actual river systems of the Yellow River Basin and its tributaries. Geological and archaeological evidence has established that a massive flood event did occur in the Yellow River Basin approximately 4,000 years ago, roughly the period that the traditional dating of the legendary emperors Yao and Shun and Yu places in Chinese history. A 2016 study published in the journal Science identified the geological signature of an outburst flood on the Yellow River that would have been the largest flood in the river's history over the past 10,000 years, generated by the collapse of a natural dam formed by a landslide at the Jishi Gorge in what is now Qinghai province. The flood that the collapse generated would have inundated the lower Yellow River Valley for decades, which matches the timescale of the Yu mythology. This finding has generated significant discussion because it suggests that the founding mythology of Chinese civilization, the story of the sage emperor who conquered the Great Flood and established the first dynasty, may be a genuine memory of a real geological event that occurred approximately 4,000 years ago, preserved through oral tradition across the 2,000 years between the event and the first written records of the mythology. If this is correct, the mythology of Yu is not simply a literary construction, but a distorted record of an actual historical and geological crisis that the ancestors of the Yellow River Valley civilizations experienced and survived. The implications for how we read the earliest layers of Chinese historical mythology are significant. If the flood mythology preserves a genuine memory of the Jishi Gorge outburst flood, other elements of the mythology may preserve genuine memories of other historical and geological events. The battles between the Yellow Emperor and the Flame Emperor that the tradition describes may preserve memories of actual conflicts between early political entities in the Yellow River Basin. The specific innovations attributed to the legendary emperors, the calendar, the writing system, the agricultural techniques, may preserve memories of actual historical innovations of specific periods. The mythology and the history are not separable in the way that the traditional academic distinction between myth and history implies. The mythology is history filtered through the distorting lens of oral transmission across 2,000 years before being written down, but history nonetheless. The Yonaguni monument connects to a broader puzzle about the Pacific that marine archaeologists have been grappling with as underwater survey technology has improved. The extent to which the drowned continental shelves of the Pacific Rim contain evidence of early human habitation that we have not yet found or properly evaluated. The coastlines of Japan, China, Korea, and Taiwan were dramatically different during the last glacial maximum, more extensive, more connected, with the Yellow Sea and the East China Sea being largely dry land. The people who lived on those extensive coastal plains left behind evidence of their presence in the form of shell middens, fire pits, habitation sites, and possibly more substantial structures. All of that evidence is now underwater at depths ranging from a few meters to over 100 meters, depending on the specific location and the sea level at the time of habitation. The underwater archaeology of the Pacific Rim is a field that has barely begun. The technological requirements, specialized diving equipment, remotely operated vehicles, underwater excavation methodology, acoustic survey systems, are demanding and expensive. The environmental conditions, poor visibility, strong currents, cold water, variable depths, are challenging. And the academic infrastructure for training underwater archaeologists and funding underwater archaeological research is less developed than the infrastructure for terrestrial archaeology, particularly in the Asian-Pacific context, where underwater archaeology as a discipline is relatively young. What this means is that a significant portion of the human habitation history of East Asia is simply inaccessible to current investigation. The populations who lived on the coastal plains of the last glacial maximum, the plains that are now the Yellow Sea and the East China Sea, left behind material culture that we cannot currently reach. The Yonaguni Monument may be part of this inaccessible record. It may not be. What is certain is that the question of what the drowned coastal plains of East Asia contain is one of the major open questions in the human prehistory of the region, and the answer, when we have the technology and the resources to pursue it systematically, will transform our understanding of who was living where in East Asia 20,000 years ago. China's ancient astronomical tradition produced, beyond the Dunhuang Star Atlas, a series of achievements in positional astronomy and calendrical mathematics that have been systematically underestimated in the standard Western-centric history of science. The Chinese astronomical tradition maintained continuous observational records from at least the 2nd century BCE, records that have allowed modern astronomers to trace the history of specific celestial phenomena, including comets, novae, and solar eclipses, much further back in time than the European observational record extends. The Chinese record of Halley's Comet, the periodic comet that returns to the inner solar system approximately every 75 years, extends back to 240 BCE, making the Chinese record the oldest continuous comet observation record in the world. Every subsequent apparition of Halley's Comet through the end of the imperial period in 1910 is recorded in the Chinese astronomical archives. These records have been used by modern astronomers to calculate the orbital mechanics of the comet's historical appearances with a precision that would not be possible from the much shorter European record alone. The Chinese astronomical tradition also maintained records of solar eclipses dating back at least 2,000 years, and these records have been used by geophysicists studying the long-term changes in the Earth's rotation rate. The rotation of the Earth is gradually slowing due to tidal friction from the Moon, and the cumulative effect of this slowing over thousands of years produces measurable discrepancies between the calculated and the observed times of ancient solar eclipses. By comparing the calculated times of ancient eclipses with the observed times recorded in the Chinese archives, geophysicists have been able to measure the rate of Earth's rotational deceleration with a precision that the shorter record of any other astronomical tradition cannot achieve. The Chinese astronomical records are not merely historical documents. They are active, scientific datasets contributing to ongoing geophysical research in the 21st century. That this astronomical tradition, with its extraordinary observational continuity and its genuine scientific utility, was largely invisible to Western scholarship until the 20th century, is itself a lesson in how the history of science has been written. Joseph Needham's monumental work, Science and Civilization in China, begun in the 1940s and still being completed by his collaborators decades after his death, was the first systematic attempt to place Chinese scientific and technological achievement in the global history of science. The picture that work has produced of a civilization that was ahead of the rest of the world in most areas of practical technology and systematic observation for most of its history has still not been fully absorbed into the popular understanding of science history. The Dunhuang Star Atlas is not an aberration or an anomaly. It is one data point in a tradition of astronomical achievement that runs continuously from at least the Shang dynasty to the present day, and that has contributed and continues to contribute to the global scientific understanding of the cosmos. The last mystery we leave with you tonight is perhaps the simplest to state and the hardest to answer. It is not about a specific object or a specific site or a specific text. It is about a number, less than 1%. Less than 1% of China's known archaeological sites have been formally excavated. The Terracotta Army, which is among the most intensively excavated sites in the world, has been under active excavation for 50 years and is perhaps 30% complete. The warriors of the main pit have been largely recovered, but 2 of the 3 primary pits remain largely unexcavated, and the burial mound itself has not been touched. The Sanxingdui site covers 12 square kilometers, and the excavated area represents a small fraction of the total. The Longyu caves have been entered and mapped in their general outlines, but not systematically excavated. The Oracle Bone Archive at Anyang has yielded 200,000 fragments, and the estimates of how many more remain in the ground range into the millions. Multiply these proportions across the entirety of the Chinese archaeological landscape, across the Yellow River Valley and the Yangtze River Basin and the Sichuan Plain and the Gansu Corridor and the Xinjiang deserts and the Yunnan Highlands and all the rest, and the scale of what is still unknown becomes clear. What we know about ancient China is what the less than 1% has told us, and the less than 1% has already produced the mysteries we have discussed tonight: the rust-free weapons, the projecting-eyed gods, the submerged town, the historyless caverns, the oldest star map, the writing that arrived without predecessors, the genetically isolated desert mummies, the self-correcting mechanical compass, the earthquake detector, the lost cauldrons of supreme power, the sealed bronze box with the gold exterior whose contents are still being analyzed. That is the less than 1%. The other 99% is in the ground. Sleep well tonight knowing that China keeps its secrets patiently, in the dark, in the earth, and that we are, slowly and carefully, learning to read them. The bronze masks of Sanxingdui reward one more consideration before we finally close. They were made to be seen. The scale of them, nearly 5 feet wide, mounted on stands, their eyes projecting outward, was designed for a ritual space, for a moment of encounter between worshippers and the divine presences the masks represented. The craftsmen who made them understood optics and scale in the practical sense that all skilled artists understand. They knew how the masks would look from a specific viewing distance, from a specific angle, in specific lighting conditions. The projecting eyes that appear so alien in a museum case, under even fluorescent lighting with a glass barrier between viewer and object, would have appeared very differently in the low lamplight of a Bronze Age ritual space, the bronze catching the fire and throwing it back, the cylindrical eye projections creating shadows that moved as the light moved. The masks were not made for museums. They were made for ceremonies whose specific character we cannot reconstruct. They were made to be present in a specific ritual space, creating a specific experience for the people who gathered in that space. And then they were broken and burned and buried, and they lay in the ground for 3,000 years, and farmers found them in 1929 and in 1986 and in 2021, and they are now in cases in Guanghan, and people travel from across the world to look at them. The experience they create in the museum, the shock of those projecting eyes, the uncanny, not quite human face, the sense of encountering something that looks back from a very great distance of time, is real, even if it is a different experience from the one they were made for. The masks create a response. That is what they were made to do. They are still doing it 3,000 years later, in a context their makers could never have imagined. That persistence of effect across 3,000 years of radical change in everything else, in the world, in the culture, in the religion, in the political structures, is perhaps the most remarkable thing about the Sanxingdui bronzes. The specific meaning they carried for the people who made them is lost. The response they generate in the people who look at them today is real. Whatever the artists of Sanxingdui were reaching for when they pushed those eyes out from the face on cylindrical stalks, whatever they were trying to make visible, they made something that still reaches the people who stand in front of it. Across 3,000 years of silence, across the breaking and the burning and the burial and the recovery, the masks still look outward, and whatever they see, they are keeping to themselves. The work of reading the Chinese archaeological record is not only the work of finding things, It is also the work of understanding what has already been found, the work of interpretation that follows discovery and that often proves more demanding than the discovery itself. The oracle bones are a good example. The 200,000 fragments recovered from Anyang were found over a period of decades, beginning in the 1890s and continuing through the systematic excavations of the 1920s and 1930s and beyond. The physical recovery of the fragments was the beginning, not the end. The decipherment of the script, the painstaking process of identifying each graph, establishing its phonetic value and its semantic range, connecting it to later Chinese characters in ways that allow the inscriptions to be read, has occupied generations of scholars across more than a century. The roughly one-third of the script that is currently considered deciphered represents the accumulated work of dozens of major scholars and hundreds of minor ones, each contribution adding a character or clarifying a grammatical pattern or establishing a new reading for a previously uncertain inscription. The remaining two-thirds, at the approximately 3,500 graphs that have not been convincingly connected to later Chinese characters and whose values therefore remain unknown, represent not just the gaps in our understanding of the oracle bone script, but the gaps in our understanding of the Shang world. Because we cannot read those characters, we cannot access the information inscribed on the approximately 60% of oracle bone inscriptions that contain them. The Shang court was asking questions and recording answers that we cannot read. The specific questions, the specific concerns, the specific aspects of Shang life that those inscriptions addressed are inaccessible to us until the remaining graphs are deciphered. The Chinese government has offered prizes for the decipherment of oracle bone characters, substantial monetary awards for researchers who successfully establish the reading of a previously unknown graph and have that reading accepted by the scholarly community. The prizes have been awarded a handful of times. The decipherment process is slow because the evidence is limited. With no Rosetta Stone and no cognate script, each new character has to be established through internal analysis of the oracle bone corpus itself, looking for patterns in how the unknown character is used in relation to characters that are already known. It is the kind of work that requires deep familiarity with the entire corpus, an analytical mind capable of holding thousands of individual data points in relationship to each other, and a willingness to spend a career on questions that may not yield to a lifetime of effort. The scholars who do this work are doing something genuinely important and doing it largely without the public attention that the spectacular discoveries of the opening of new terracotta army pits, the Sanxingdui bronze masks, generate. The interpretation is less visible than the discovery. It is not less significant. Tonight's 20 mysteries share a quality that is worth naming clearly before we rest. They are not mysteries because the evidence is absent. In every case we have discussed, the evidence is physically present, in a museum case, in an excavated pit, in a manuscript collection, in the geochemical readings from a soil survey, in the genetic profile of a mummy extracted from the Tarim Desert. The evidence is there. The mystery is in the gap between what the evidence shows and what the current state of knowledge can explain. The chromium on the swords is measurable. What we cannot explain is how it was applied. The fish scale pattern on the Longyu Cave's walls is visible and consistent. What we cannot explain is why no record of the cave's creation exists. The Dunhuang Star Atlas is digitized and available online. What we cannot reconstruct is the observational program that produced its 1/350 accurately plotted stars. The Tarim mummies are in their cases and their genomes are sequenced. What we cannot explain is how a population with ancient North Eurasian ancestry ended up isolated in a Central Asian desert for thousands of years, wearing tartan-patterned wool. In each case, the evidence points toward a knowledge or a practice or a historical reality that existed and that has not been fully recovered. The knowledge was real, the practice was real, the historical reality was real. What is missing is the documentation, the record that would allow us to trace the path from the result we can see to the process that produced it. This gap between result and process, between the object and the knowledge that made it, is the specific character of Chinese archaeological mystery. It is not the mystery of the impossible, Nothing we have discussed tonight required capabilities that were beyond the human capacity of the period. The chromium coating did not require a chemistry laboratory. The Longyu caves did not require mechanical excavation equipment. The Star Atlas did not require a telescope. All of these things were achievable with the technology of their time in the hands of people with the right knowledge and the right practice. The mystery is that the knowledge and the practice that produced them are not in the record alongside the results. China produced extraordinary results. The documentation of how it produced them is incomplete, in some cases to the point of total absence. And so we are left, as archaeologists and historians and scientists and curious people, lying in the dark, listening to the story of it, with the results and the questions. The results are extraordinary, the questions are genuine, and both the results and the questions will be there in the morning, patient and unchanged, waiting for whoever is ready to look at them more carefully than anyone has looked at them yet. Sleep well. The earth of China is keeping its secrets. And, slowly, carefully, one discovery at a time, we are learning to ask it the right questions. The Silk Road that connected China to the rest of the ancient world was not merely a trade route. It was the world's first information superhighway, a channel through which not only goods but ideas, technologies, religions, languages and people traveled in both directions across thousands of miles of steppe and desert and mountain range. The Chinese silk that Roman senators draped around themselves at banquets in the 1st century BCE arrived in Rome without those senators having any accurate knowledge of where it came from. Roman geographers called the producers of silk the Ceres, the silk people, and described them as living at the absolute eastern edge of the world, tall and red-haired and long-lived, their country separated from the rest of civilization by impassable mountains and rivers. The Han Dynasty Chinese who produced the silk had similarly vague ideas about where it ultimately ended up, knowing only that the Western merchants who bought it in the markets of Chang'an paid in gold and silver coins that bore the faces of rulers no Chinese scholar had ever met. The Dunhuang Star Atlas traveled along the Silk Road. The cowrie shells in the Sanxingdui pits came from coastal trade networks that were connected, at their outer edges, to the broader Silk Road exchange system. The Tarim mummies in their tartan clothing occupied the Tarim Basin, the corridor through which the Silk Road passed, the passage between the Tian Shan Mountains to the north and the Kunlun Mountains to the south, through which traders and travelers had been moving for millennia before the formal establishment of the Han Dynasty trade routes. The Silk Road did not create these connections. It formalized and expanded connections that already existed. What traveled along these connections, in addition to goods, was knowledge. Medical knowledge, astronomical knowledge, mathematical knowledge, agricultural knowledge, technological knowledge. All of these were transmitted imperfectly and sporadically along the trade routes that connected China to Central Asia, to the Middle East, to the Mediterranean world. The specific mechanism of transmission was not systematic. It was the accumulation of individual acts of curiosity and exchange, a craftsman watching how a foreign merchant's tools worked and adapting the technique for his own use, a physician comparing notes with a visiting healer from a distant tradition, an astronomer exchanging observations with a traveler who had spent time at a distant observatory. None of these exchanges were documented in ways that make them recoverable from the historical record. They happened in the margins of the documented history, in the conversations that left no written record. But the physical evidence of the exchange is sometimes preserved in the objects. The specific bronze alloy compositions at Sanxingdui show contact with Shang bronze casting traditions. The jade objects in the Sanxingdui pits show contact with the Liangzhu tradition of 1,000 years earlier. The oracle bones show script in a fully developed form that implies prior development we cannot trace. Each of these is an artifact of exchange and transmission whose specific history, the specific conversations and observations and adaptations that produced it, is gone. The objects survive. The conversations that connected them to the broader world are silent. The Silk Road and its predecessors transmitted what could be transmitted through the specific channels available: goods, travelers, the knowledge that travelers carried in their heads. what could not be transmitted through those channels. The embodied knowledge of the specialist craftsman, the tacit understanding accumulated through decades of practice in a specific workshop tradition, stayed where it was, dying with the practitioners who held it when those practitioners had no successors. This is why the Chinese technological record looks the way it does, connected to the broader world through channels of exchange that brought in new materials and new ideas, and simultaneously isolated in its specific craft traditions in ways that prevented the full transmission of the technical knowledge that produced its most remarkable achievements. The chromium treatment on the Qin swords was not transmitted to the Han craftsmen who succeeded the Qin workshops. The piece mold casting technique of the Shang bronzesmiths was transmitted. It survived through the Zhou period and into later dynasties because it was useful and widely practiced, and the transmission channels were intact. The specific calibration of Zhang Heng's seismoscope was not transmitted because Zhang Heng died without a successor in the specific domain of precision instrument making, and the knowledge lived in him alone. What was transmitted survived. What was not transmitted is a mystery. The 9 bronze cauldrons of the Great Use, the lost objects of supreme power, point towards something important about how Chinese civilization has understood the relationship between objects and authority. The cauldrons were not merely symbols of the mandate of heaven. They were, in the political theology of the early Chinese states, constitutive of it. To possess the 9 cauldrons was not to hold a symbol of the right to rule. It was to hold the right to rule itself, materially embodied in 9 bronze vessels. The authority was in the objects, not merely represented by them. This understanding of objects as constitutive of authority, as things that do not merely represent power but actually hold it, runs through Chinese material culture in ways that make the physical world of Chinese history more densely charged than a purely symbolic reading would suggest. The oracle bones were not records of divination. They were the divination itself, the physical medium through which the communication between the royal court and the ancestor spirits occurred. The bronze ritual vessels were not merely containers for offerings, they were the point of contact between the human world and the divine world, their specific form and decoration part of the mechanism by which the ritual worked. The jade objects in the Sangsingdui pits were not merely valuable, they were sacred in a way that made their destruction in the pit a ritual act rather than a waste. This understanding explains why the physical disappearance of the 9 cauldrons was such a significant event in Chinese political history. It was not that the symbol of legitimate rule was lost, it was that the legitimate rule itself was lost materially in the depths of a river. The subsequent dynasties that could not produce the 9 cauldrons had to find other ways of establishing the mandate of heaven, through astronomical omens, through the performance of specific rituals, through the accumulation of evidence that heaven approved of their rule. The cauldrons had been the simplest and most direct way. Hold the objects, hold the authority. Without them, authority became a more complicated and more contested thing, and the political history of China from the late Zhou period onward reflects that complication. The search for the cauldrons has never entirely stopped. The river surveys that have been conducted using modern sonar and underwater cameras are the most recent manifestation of a search that has been ongoing in various forms for 2,500 years. The rivers that are candidates for their location, the Xi River and its tributaries in what is now Shandong and Jiangsu provinces, have been surveyed without definitive result. Whether the cauldrons exist in the form the tradition describes, whether they are in a river, whether they will ever be found, these questions remain open. But the persistence of the search across 2.5 millennia of Chinese history is itself a measure of the specific weight that Chinese civilization has placed on the relationship between objects and authority. The cauldrons matter not because finding them would resolve an academic mystery, but because in the political theology that has shaped Chinese civilization, they are the authority, and the question of whether that authority is recoverable is not merely historical. We end where we began, with the yellow earth of Shanxi and what it holds. The Loess Plateau is one of the most distinctive landscapes in China. A vast expanse of fine wind-deposited soil, deeply eroded by centuries of agriculture and rainfall into the spectacular gully landscape that makes Shanxi's terrain so immediately recognizable. The loess is extraordinarily deep. In some areas it reaches hundreds of meters, and extraordinarily preserving. The fine, dry soil excludes water and air in ways that slower draining soils do not, creating anaerobic conditions that protect organic material from decomposition. This is why the terracotta army's wooden and organic components have been found in better condition than wood buried in other soils for the same period. This is why the burial goods in Shanxi's ancient tombs have been preserved with a fidelity that has made the region one of the most archaeologically productive in the world. But the loess also hides. The deep yellow soil covers sites so completely that their surface expression is nothing. A slight irregularity in the terrain, a different quality of vegetation, the occasional fragment of ceramic turning up in a ploughed field. The terracotta army pits were not visible from the surface before the 1974 well drilling broke through them. The area around the burial mound of Qin Shi Huang, the great earthen mound that is visible as a prominent feature of the landscape, has been known as the location of the first emperor's tomb for 2,000 years, and yet the specific contents of the burial chamber beneath it remain completely unknown. The knowledge that something important is there has not by itself been sufficient to reveal what it is. This is the paradox of Chinese archaeology. The most important sites are often the most visible, and the most visible sites are the least excavated because the scale of what they contain requires a level of preparation and technology that has not yet been achieved. The burial mound of Qin Shi Huang is the most prominent unexcavated site in the world. It is visible on Google Earth as a large hill, clearly artificial in its regularity, clearly ancient in its scale, sitting in plain sight in the Shanxi Plain surrounded by farmland and tourist facilities and research stations. Everyone knows it is there. No one has opened it. The caution that prevents its opening, the knowledge, earned in the first moments of the terracotta army's exposure to air, that what is inside may be destroyed by the act of discovery, is the right caution. It is the caution of a civilization that has learned from its own history that patience is more valuable than haste, and so the burial chamber of the first emperor of China waits, as it has waited for 22 centuries, in the dark beneath the yellow earth of Shanxi. The Mercury rivers are still, the pearl constellations are still, the bronze mechanisms that once moved the rivers are still and silent. Whatever vision of his empire Qin Shi Huang arranged for his eternity, whatever miniature world he built to carry into whatever came after, is unchanged in the dark, patient as stone, patient as earth, waiting for the morning when the technology and the will and the wisdom converge to open it safely. That morning has not yet come, but it is coming. And tonight, in the quiet, across the distance of 22 centuries, and the width of the world that separates wherever you are from the Shanxi Plain, the sealed chamber keeps its counsel. The mysteries keep their silence, and the earth of China holds, as it has always held, more than we know.